Chapter 927. This was very awkward. Dean coughed twice. He was used to traveling alone. He didn't think that he had a navigator by his side. Can you tell me the location and distance of the kingdom of God? Dean looked at the woods in front of him and asked in a serious tone. Looking at his side profile, Felicia covered her mouth and chuckled. After laughing for a while, she said, "You're lucky to have met me. Otherwise, you would be in big trouble if you followed this path all the way to the end." "What do you mean?" Dean turned to look at her. It seemed that he had forgotten the previous embarrassment. Felicia chuckled. "This is the opposite of the kingdom of God. You are getting further and further away from the kingdom of God. Where do you think you will go if you continue to move forward? Isn't this bad luck?" Dean's eyes moved. "You mean? Is this the place you mentioned outside the border?" "Of course." Dean pondered for a moment. He had considered such a result when he came out from Sylvia. But in his opinion, even if he couldn't find the kingdom of God, he would find other giant walls sooner or later. Even if he didn't touch other giant walls, he would be able to see a new world. Perhaps he would be able to see the place outside the kingdom of God. This was the reason why he didn't choose to go in circles. After all, the earth was round. Isolated place outside the border. Dean thought of the troll clan that Felicia mentioned. His heart was full of expectation and excitement. "You said that this place is remote. How far is it from the kingdom of God? How far is it from the border?" Felicia looked at him in surprise. "Do you want to go outside the border? I advise you to give up on this idea. This is the east side of the God Nation. I heard you say that the south side of the God Nation has the giant devil race, the east side has the fire dragon race, and the north side has the snow ape race. Although I have never seen the fire dragon race in the east side, I heard that they are even more terrifying than the giant devil race in the south. With our strength, although it is not bad here, if we meet the fire dragon race, we will definitely die." Dadian shook his head. "Tell me the location of the kingdom of God. I may not go there." Seeing that Roland still had not given up on the idea, Felicia frowned. She picked up a dry twig and walked to a place where the soil was relatively soft. Using the twig as a pen, she drew a huge circle on the ground and poked a small hole in the west of the center of the circle. "This is the Holy Kingdom, and where we are." The tip of the branch drew to the east, where it was close to the giant circle, and poked a small hole. "This is probably where we are. It's quite far from the God's kingdom, and it belongs to the border area, close to the isolated land." Dean stared at the circle. "What is the distance in the middle?" "I don't know either, but it will take me a month to get here from the Divine Kingdom, and this is a smooth journey with the strength of the Abyss Squad. If I were alone, it would probably take me more than 3 months to get here." Felicia looked at him. "Although we are close to the isolated land, but the closer we are to the border, the more remote it will be. The number of monsters in these remote areas are denser, and many of them are high-level monsters. So it will take at least half a month to get to the border from here." Dean nodded. He had a general understanding of the location of Sylvia on the map. He didn't expect that the weak Sylvia would be closer to the God's kingdom. If he had chosen the right direction, then perhaps he would have reached the God's kingdom by now. "Do you know the coordinates of the other walls?" Dean asked again. Felicia shook her head. "The map we got doesn't contain the coordinates of the God's wall. We only have the marks of the Devil's Pit. After all, our strength is enough to destroy the God's wall if we go to it. Some people go out to perform tasks and loot the God's wall. Anyway, no one can trace them after they leave without leaving any traces. However, the God's kingdom has a strict ban in this area. If someone from the Abyss is found to have infiltrated the God's wall, they will receive the most severe punishment. Not all the Abyss can guarantee that they won't leave any traces. After all, once the news is leaked, the Abyss will send people to investigate. No one knows what kind of perception ability the Abyss has. It is said that some of the Abyss's perception ability can detect you even if you are not close to the God's wall." Dadian was startled, as he didn't think that there would be such a rule. But it was reasonable. Otherwise, the kingdom of God wouldn't know what happened to the wall in the current communication environment. It would take a decade and a half for the kingdom of God to find out. "Are you not interested in the God's kingdom?" Dean looked at her. "Not interested." She stared at Dean. "It's not a joke. Countless warriors of the God's kingdom are sacrificed outside the God's kingdom every year. It's common for the abyss to fall. Even the abyss's lord will fall outside the God's kingdom. If I have a choice, I don't want to get close to the God's kingdom in my life, let alone step outside the God's kingdom. There is nothing to see there. I'm not that curious. You should know that curiosity often kills people. Dean didn't expect her to be such a conservative person, but it wasn't that she didn't have adventurous spirit. Perhaps she had lived in the God's kingdom since childhood. That's why she didn't want to get close to the God's kingdom. But for him, he had a strong curiosity about the God's kingdom. He was like a child living inside the God's kingdom. He was eager to see the scenery outside the God's kingdom. He wanted to see what the earth of the past had become now. Can you tell me about the East? Dean asked. Felicia didn't expect Dean to be so persistent. She sighed. As your friend, I sincerely hope that you can dispel this terrible idea. But it seems that I can't persuade you with just a few words. I'll tell you what I know so that you can think about it. Thank you. Duddian nodded. His tone was somewhat sincere. Felicia shook her head and pointed at the huge circle on the ground with a twig. Other than the fire dragons, there are also many powerful monsters in the east of the border. Therefore, the soldiers stationed at the border have to defend against the invasion of the fire dragons and the monsters at the border. Therefore, the security here is very tight. Without the permission of the 7 kings of the kingdom of God, no one can cross the border. Unless you and I have the power of the 7 kings or the Lord of the Abyss, it's possible to cross the border. But once we cross the border, it won't be easy to come back. Duddian was startled. His brows wrinkled. The obsession in his heart suddenly dissipated. Although he was eager to see the world outside the God's kingdom, but what Felicia said was right. It wasn't just an adventure. Going out was a big problem. As for coming back, it was even more dangerous. Moreover, he couldn't guarantee that if he was lucky enough to come back and meet Felicia again in the God's kingdom, she wouldn't sell him out. Felicia saw that Dean's face was gloomy, so she continued. There are many monsters on both sides of the border. Even if you don't get killed by the monsters, you'll be arrested by the border guards. You'll be sentenced to death on the spot. Even I will be considered a felony if I get close to the border without the order of the 7 kings. I'll be stripped of my position and demoted to a pariah. Dean was silent. The border issue was not a trivial matter. Especially the 7 kings couldn't deal with the monsters outside the God's kingdom. Okay. Dean exhaled a breath. Felicia was relieved. It's good that you can figure it out. We'll go and have a look. We'll come back when we get close. Dean didn't wait for her to finish her words. He looked at her stunned face and coughed. Anyway, we are already here. We are so close to the border. There are some things that are always good to know. There's an old saying that there is no harm in seeing more things. Some things are better not to see. Felicia's face was dark. But we've seen it. Instead of seeing the tip of the iceberg, it's better to see the whole picture. At least we'll have a clear idea. Dean said. Felicia raised her eyebrows. Clear idea? What do you want to do? Duddian knew that he was speechless, but didn't panic. What can I do? Didn't you say that you were going to introduce me to the Bloodthorn Legion? I guess with my ability, even if I don't join the Bloodthorn Legion sooner or later, I will be noticed by the higher-ups. Maybe one day they will send me to the border. It's better to understand now, so that I don't have to worry about the future. You're thinking too much. The higher-ups will give you a detailed introduction. Felicia immediately said. Dean saw that he couldn't persuade her. Anyway, I'm going to have a look. Do you want to go? You're a rogue, Felicia said bitterly. Dean shrugged. Well, I'll go with you. Felicia sighed. She knew that she had no other choice. Although she got along well with Dean, and they seemed to have become friends, but she knew that Dean wouldn't let her go so easily. The reason why Dean was determined to go was to test her attitude. She knew that Dean's big secret was that he could control the Corpse King. Although she didn't show anything unusual about this matter, because she was afraid of attracting Dean's attention, but she knew that even if she was blind, Dean would still be suspicious of her, or even kill her. Then go. Dean had an expression that said, "This is what you agreed to." He turned around and walked away. Felicia smiled slightly. She suddenly doubted whether she was mistaken. Perhaps if she said that she could separate now, could she really get away? She shook her head, threw away the branch, and followed behind Dean. As the two of them got farther and farther away from the wall, the number of monsters they encountered along the way gradually increased. From time to time, monsters above level 200 would jump out from the ground or the darkness of the bushes to attack them. If it was in the past, when he just left Sylvia, Dean would inevitably be in a hurry to deal with them. He would even have to turn around to escape. But now he could kill them without any effort. The longer he walked, the more he realized the meaning of the name Abyss Walker. It was too vivid. Now, he could completely keep moving in a straight line. Even if he encountered abyss-level monsters along the way, he didn't need to be afraid. It seemed that the dangerous abyss was just a suburban wilderness under his feet, and he was a veteran hunter who had experienced hundreds of battles. Time passed quickly. Puff! Blood bloomed. A monster snake that was nearly 100 meters long fell to the ground softly. Its back was covered with fine scales, like a snake or an alligator. Its tail was forked. At this moment, one of the snake's heads was smashed, and it lost its life. Felicia's figure lightly jumped over and cut open the strange snake's stomach. After a while, she took out a small worm and collected it into the special soul worm jar that Dean gave her. The parasitic soul worm would die in a short time after leaving the host, but it could survive in this special soul worm jar for 1 or 2 months. 3-star legendary monster, Rock Soul Worm. Felicia handed the special soul worm jar to Dean and smiled. I didn't expect our luck to be so good. We met 2 legendary monsters in just 2 days. Dean took the jar and threw it into his backpack. Now, the legendary parasitic soul worm was no longer attractive to him. From Felicia and the temple's information, he knew that the way to become stronger in the abyss mainly depended on the ice worm and the help of other drugs. For example, some drugs could stimulate the body, increase strength in a short time, or harden the skin, but these drugs had certain side effects. There were also some drugs that could permanently increase the strength of the human body, but it was good enough to increase the strength by 10%. These drugs were very expensive, and they were priceless treasures in the kingdom of God. For an abyss like Dean, the parasitic soul worm had lost its value. After injecting it, it had no effect. It could only be used to train subordinates, give it to relatives, sell it as currency, and so on. Moreover, this parasitic soul worm was only a 3-star legendary monster. According to Felicia, legendary monsters were divided into 5 values, from 1 star to 5 stars. 5 stars was the rarest. For example, the Dream Breeder that Dean knew was a 5-star legendary monster. The Supplicant was a 4-star legendary monster, and the Splitter was only a 3-star legendary monster. However, according to Felicia, the Splitter was a relatively precious existence among the 3-star legendary monsters. It was ranked at the top, far from the Rock Soul Worm, which was an ordinary 3-star legendary monster. Chapter 928. According to Felicia, Splitter was classified as a 3-star legendary monster because of its attack power. Otherwise, it would only be a 1-star legendary monster. Dean didn't pay attention to Felicia's words. He knew in his heart whether he was strong or not. 10 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dean and Felicia kept moving forward. Except for resting at night, they kept moving at high speed during the day. They didn't stop even when they passed through the territory of the monsters from the abyss. As long as they didn't step into the devil's pit, they were almost unimpeded in the ordinary abyss area. Let's stop here. After eating half of the barbecue in her hand, Felicia turned to look at Dean. We are going to reach the border. You have seen that the number of monsters we met yesterday and the day before yesterday is getting more and more. They are getting stronger and stronger. If we continue like this, we will soon touch the border. It's not too late to turn back now. You have seen what you want to see. Dean ate the barbecue in his hand, stood up, and pointed to a mountain in front of them. We should be able to overlook the border from there, if we are close enough to the border. Felicia glanced at him, but didn't say anything. They quickly finished their food and continued their journey. In less than an hour, they arrived at the mountain that Dean wanted. They left a lot of monster corpses at the foot of the mountain. Felicia said while climbing the mountain. There are so many monsters living on this mountain. It is estimated that it is the territory of a big monster. Be careful. Even if it is the abyss, the two of us are enough to kill it. Dean quickly climbed up and soon reached the top of the mountain. He didn't see the predicted monster lord. The air at the top of the mountain was particularly fresh. Dean looked up at the clouds and said, "You said that thunderbirds are birds raised by the kingdom of God? There should be a lot of them living in the clouds near the border, right?" Dean chatted with Felicia on the way. He learned that the frightening thunderbirds were war monsters raised by the kingdom of God. They were spread all over the abyss. Many dominators in the abyss who had the ability to fly were afraid of them. Even the Lord of the Abyss didn't dare to provoke large flocks of thunderbirds. Thunderbirds lived in the clouds. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the overlords of the sky. They lived in groups. When a group of thunderbirds concentrated their power, it was no less than a thunderbolt. This kind of war-type demonic beast was extremely effective in air defense. Felicia nodded. There are a lot of thunderbirds at the border. Thunderbirds are rare in the clouds and the abyss, and most of them are free-range. But it's different here. Even the Lord of the Deep Abyss will be killed instantly by the thunderbirds. As for people like us, we'll be turned into ashes instantly, even if there are 8 or 10 of us. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling the truth. Of course, I believe what you said is true. Dean had a deeper understanding of the power of lightning. However, although lightning was strong, there were ways to restrain it. Insulator materials and conductive devices were the nemesis of thunderbirds. He suspected that the 7 kings had used technological means to enslave these thunderbirds and drive them into their own weapons of war. He suddenly had a bold idea. It would cost a lot to build a power station in Sylvia, but it wouldn't bring much electricity. The national grid in the old era was dominated by nuclear power plants. Wind power, water power, and solar power couldn't be compared. However, the cost of building a power station was small, but it occupied a large area. This was nothing in the old era. After all, although there were many people in the old era, the whole world was human territory. There were vast lands for human use. But in today's world, the area inside the giant wall was limited, and resources were also limited. In addition, the sky was covered with thick nuclear dust, and the light was thin. The most cost-effective solar power station wasn't effective, so they could only rely on wind and water power. However, these two were barely effective inside the giant wall. After all, the giant wall was thousands of meters high. The wind inside the giant wall wouldn't be strong, and most of the time, there wouldn't be any wind. So the efficiency of the wind power station was very low. The same was true for hydropower. The water inside the giant wall was limited. It was enough to provide food and water for people, and part of the water could be taken out for recycling. At most, 5 or 10 small and medium-sized hydropower stations could be built. Moreover, the land inside the giant wall was limited. If he wanted to build in large quantities, he would have to compress the living area of a residence. These were the most basic limitations. Other materials, manpower, and other aspects made it difficult for Dean to mass-produce power stations at this stage. Therefore, the electricity generated at the beginning was not enough to electrocute an abyss. As for where to get power, it seemed to be an excellent power treasure house in front of him. He suddenly felt that he was really stupid before. He couldn't see the wealth in front of him. It was probably because of ignorance. What are you thinking about? Felicia saw a trace of excitement in Dean's eyes. There was a bad premonition in her heart. She frowned and asked. Dean came back to his senses, and the strange look in his eyes disappeared. He said calmly, "Nothing. I just think that with these thunderbirds, these aliens won't be able to launch an airstrike. We just need to hold the ground." Felicia nodded. "Yes, but the aliens also have strong flying magic beasts. But compared to our thunderbirds, they're still too weak. It's not easy to break through the thunderbirds cultivated by the 7 kings. Moreover, there are rules in the kingdom of God. If you capture or hurt thunderbirds without authorization, you will be punished with treason. Thunderbirds are the war magic beasts of our kingdom of God. They are also the guardian of the kingdom." Dean raised his eyebrows. What if the Thunderbirds attack us first? We can't hurt them. Anyway, it's a capital crime, Felicia said without thinking. Dean didn't say anything, but was looking forward to it. He used his X-ray vision to look forward. His line of sight penetrated through layers of void. Countless dust was peeled off from his line of sight. In a distant place in the sky, there was a gray, giant shadow standing. He could only vaguely see a huge silhouette. It seemed to be something similar to a giant wall, but it towered into the clouds. Its height made people look up to it. That's the border defense wall. Felicia pointed to the direction Dean was looking at. With your eyesight, you should be able to barely see a shadow. This God of War wall is tens of thousands of feet high and completely isolates the border. Countless aliens and strange beasts have crashed into the God of War wall and died, but they couldn't shake the God of War wall. This is the protection given to us by God. Only God can create such a great miracle. Dean's eyes slightly moved. Although he had heard her description before, he was still shocked to see the gray giant shadow with his own eyes. The God of War wall had one more word than the God of War wall, but the height difference was like heaven and earth. It was 3,300 meters high, more than 3 times the height of the God of War wall. To build such a giant wall in a land full of monsters and aliens, it was not an exaggeration to say that it was a miracle. Such a project was not something that humans could create. Moreover, this God of War wall surrounded the entire kingdom of God. Its area was vast, and its length alone was comparable to the Great Wall of China, which had 5,000 years of civilization. In the old era, the role of the Great Wall to China was equivalent to the role of the God of War wall in the era of monsters. The height of tens of thousands of feet was enough to isolate most of the impact of the beast tide on the land. How many corpses would be piled up to climb up this giant wall? Moreover, there was a group of Thunderbirds lurking in the clouds. The top and bottom of the wall were impregnable. Perhaps the guy who created this God of War wall can really be called a god. Dudian thought in his heart. At this moment, he didn't despise the superstition of the people who believed in the gods. Anyone who saw such a majestic building and a miracle that was difficult to achieve would believe in the existence of the gods. It seemed that the role of the wall was to tell the world that the gods existed and they were the things left by the gods. The God of War wall is so high. How could those aliens break through the border? Dean thought of what Felicia had said about the countless casualties at the border. He had a clearer impression of the aliens outside the border. Felicia nodded and sighed. The strength of the alien races is far beyond our imagination. Since young, I have heard from my elders that although the alien races are unable to destroy the God of War wall, their monstrous strength makes it hard to defend against them. For example, the giant demon alien race is adept at climbing. Although the God of War wall is steep, it is like a flat ground to them. In the end, the warriors on the wall have to resist. Dean nodded. For some monsters, there is no difference between the height of 1 kilometer and 3,000 meters. Have you seen enough? Let's go. All right. Dean glanced at the gray shadow of the wall. He turned around and went down the mountain with Felicia. Hiss. At this moment, a black shadow was galloping through the clouds in the distance. Dean and Felicia stopped to look. The black shadow was flying very fast. In the blink of an eye, it was above their heads. Felicia exclaimed, "Purple-winged dragon. Is it a border envoy?" Dean also saw that the black shadow was a dragon. However, it was different from the one he had seen in Sylvia. That one seemed to be light yellow, but this one was purple-black. Its physique was also bigger. After knowing that Thunderbirds were war beasts raised by the kingdom of God, he also understood the real reason why Thunderbirds didn't attack dragons. They were the henchmen of the same boss, so they didn't dare to fight each other. As the two looked up, the purple-winged dragon suddenly swooped down. Its body circled and turned back. Dean and Felicia's faces changed. Soon, the purple-winged dragon turned around and flew straight toward the two of them. The strong wind from the dragon's wings blew the trees in the mountain. All the trees bent down as if they were subservient subjects. Dean knew that it was too late to escape, so he stood still with Felicia. Looking at the purple-winged dragon from a close distance, Dean suddenly felt that the Arctic dragon he had met before was just like this. The latter's size was even a size smaller. At this time, Dean also saw 3 figures standing on the dragon's head. They were wearing strange clothes. One of them was wearing a scarlet cloak that was fluttering in the wind, making a trembling sound. 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s. They exuded a powerful aura, but they didn't emit any heat fluctuations. This was the reason why Dean didn't notice them at first. Dean knew that it wasn't only cold-blooded magic marks that could hide the heat source. There were many secret books in the Kingdom of God, such as the dragon blood technique of the Demon Dragon clan, which could control the blood and hide the heat source. 2 abysses? Huh, this is the Corpse King? The 3 glanced at each other and saw the strength of Dean and Felicia. This made Dean's heart sink. He had hidden the heat source, so did Felicia. Moreover, the 3 saw Aisha, which made him feel a bit of crisis. "Which god's wall are you from?" asked a mature youth who was holding a giant sword. He had a buzz cut, and his eyes were full of sharpness. His voice was very calm. Dean didn't open his mouth as he saw Felicia's eyes. He closed his mouth. Felicia stepped forward and said, "3 sirs, I'm the captain of the 5th squad of the Bloodthorn Legion, Felicia. I was carrying out a mission here, but something happened and I lost my medal. This is my blood mark." She rolled up her sleeve. There was a blood-red tattoo on her arm. It was a thorny flower with poisonous thorns. The 3 saw her blood mark, and the coldness in their eyes faded a lot. The tall woman on the left softly said, "What's the matter with the Corpse King? Why didn't it attack you?" Dean bowed his head and said, "3 sirs, we met the Corpse King when we were carrying out a mission. We used a special method to stop its ability to move. We are going to bring it back to the Kingdom of God." Felicia turned to look at Dean. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She was ready to betray Dean once he was exposed. She didn't expect that Dean would think of an excuse in this short time. Hand over the Kingdom of God? She had long seen that Dean regarded the Corpse King as more important than his own life. From his usual behavior, she could see that most of the Corpse King was his former loved one. She had seen such things many times. Many deranged people were unwilling to give up on their infected relatives and lovers. They would imprison them and detain them by their side. They would even chop off their hands and feet, leaving only their bodies just to keep them by their side. However, she knew that Dean was different from these people. Even this Corpse King was different from other Corpse Kings. She didn't know the specific difference, but she knew that it was Dean's big secret. The 3 heard Dean's accent, and their expressions changed. The leader asked, "You're not from the Kingdom of God?" Dean nodded. "I haven't joined the Bloodthorn Legion yet. I'm going back to join." Felicia also said, "3 sirs. He came out from the wall and is going to join the Bloodthorn Legion." The 3 of them looked at Dean, but didn't say anything. They didn't think too much about the King of Corpses. After all, it was impossible to control the King of Corpses in the Kingdom of God. But it wasn't difficult to abolish the King of Corpses. Chapter 9:29. The young man nodded slightly and looked at Dean and Felicia. His eyes lit up. "There is an emergency at the border of the Empire. We lack manpower. You 2 can come with us." Dean frowned. Felicia's face changed. "Elder, I just finished my mission. I have to go back and report to the king. I'm afraid." The buzz-cut youth glanced at her. "The Bloodthorn Corps is also a powerful army of the Empire. As a squad leader, how can you not see the bigger picture? The border defense is a huge matter, and we are currently lacking manpower. Since you guys are here, it's only right that you put in some effort. Of course, I won't mistreat you. This time, I'll let you join the Border Defense Army in the name of temporary enlistment. When the time comes, your achievements will be recorded in your identity system. You should know how fast you can accumulate achievements at the border. If you're lucky, after this battle, you might be able to be promoted from a squad leader to a senior leader and be on equal footing with us." Felicia smiled. "Elder, it's not that I don't want to contribute to the Empire, but my mission is urgent. The king is waiting for me to go back and report. I can't afford to offend the king if I delay here." "Can't afford to?" Hearing Felicia's hint, the brush-cut young man's eyes flashed with coldness, but he didn't say anything. The Bloodthorn Sovereign was a supreme ruler. He couldn't afford to offend him, nor would he dare to forcefully recruit Felicia. However, he would remember this threat. In that case, you should go back and report. The king's mission is more important. There was no anger on the youth's face. He looked at Dean. Little brother, you have just come out of the wall. You haven't joined the Legion yet. This time you will come with us to the border. If you're lucky, with your abyss-level strength and this contribution, you should be able to directly become a squad leader in the army after the battle is over. This is much better than reporting to the Empire now and having the identity of an ordinary member randomly arranged for you. At that time, won't you still have to carry out missions and accumulate contributions before you can be promoted? How can it be faster than accumulating achievements at the border? Dean's face slightly changed. He could see that this was not a good thing. Since there was an emergency at the border, it meant that it was extremely dangerous. It was very likely, oh no, it should be 100% that they would fight with aliens. His strength wasn't enough in the battlefield. It was like a general who was slightly stronger than an army. He was like duckweed in the water. One mistake, and he would be destroyed. As for accumulating merits and being promoted to captain, as the youth said, he needed to be lucky to accumulate achievements. He would just lie here forever. Elder, Felicia has promised me that she will recommend me to the king. I've just left God's wall, and I'm still inexperienced. I'm afraid that I'll cause trouble for the elders if I go to the border. I'll come back after a few years of experience. Dean had a headache. Humph! Before he could finish his words, a cold snort interrupted him. The brush-cut young man's face turned completely cold. He said condescendingly, "The border defense of the Empire is a big deal. We are the border envoys of the Empire. We have the right to forcibly conscript all civilians. Do you want me to forcibly conscript you?" A trace of gloominess flashed in Dean's eyes, but he quickly restrained himself. He turned to look at Felicia and signaled her to say a few words for him. Felicia saw Dean's eyes and shook her head slightly. She wanted to tell him that she couldn't help either. Dean was a bit angry when he saw that she was going to stand by, but he wasn't angry at Felicia. After all, he and Felicia weren't close friends. It was normal for them to go their separate ways in the face of a disaster. Moreover, Felicia should be eager to leave him so that her life would be guaranteed. It was strange for her to help him. He was angry because he couldn't refuse and the tough attitude of the youth. "Don't waste time. Come on up." The youth frowned. Dean's mouth slightly twitched. He looked at Felicia and said, "Since Elder said so, I will go with Elder to the border. We will meet again in the kingdom of God." There was a trace of pity in Dean's eyes. Meet again in the kingdom of God? You probably don't know that the temporary conscripts are often sent to the front line of the war. The survival rate is less than 10%. In other words, 90% of them will die. What kind of probability is that? However, she didn't want to break up with Dean at this juncture. She knew what Dean was thinking. He was worried that she would reveal the secret of the undead. However, even if she said it now, it would be meaningless. If Dean died, the king would blame her for not bringing Dean back. As for talking about this matter with the 3 border envoys, she didn't even think about it. They didn't belong to the same system. Telling them about Dean's secret would not benefit her at all. Instead, it would help the enemy. "I'll wait for you," she replied. Dean glanced at her and didn't say anything. He came to the side and grabbed Aisha's shoulder in a rough way, as if to guard against her counterattack. Then he brought her all the way to the purple-winged dragon, jumped, and landed on the dragon's back. The dragon's back was wide enough for 7 or 8 people to stand on it. "Kill this thing. It's useless for you to go to the border to help." The youth frowned. Dean clenched his fingers, but soon loosened them. He whispered, "Elder, this is the gift I'm going to give to the army. I'm hoping to get a promotion with it." The youth sneered but didn't say anything. The King of Corpses was indeed a rare experimental material. It could be exchanged for a lot of money. However, he had to have the opportunity to return to the Empire. In his eyes, Dean was already a dead man. "Let's go," the one-eyed middle-aged man urged. The youth didn't say anything. He glanced at Felicia on the ground and remembered her appearance. Today's threat made him lose face. In the future, he wouldn't let her go easily. The purple-winged flying dragon spread its wings and soared into the sky, kicking up a strong gust of wind. In an instant, it rose more than 1,000 meters into the sky and flew into the distance. Felicia instantly turned into a small dot. She was getting farther and farther away until she couldn't be seen. I hope we're not too late. The tall woman's hair fluttered in the wind. She looked forward. She wasn't afraid, even though she was thousands of meters high in the sky. Her eyes revealed a bit of worry. I heard from the investigation team that the situation is a bit serious. I hope we won't cause any big trouble. Don't worry. Nothing has happened on the War God's Wall for 100 years. It shouldn't be serious. Most likely, the border guards were careless and let these beasts attack. The youth said calmly, "It's our bad luck. Out of the 20 districts on the War God's Wall, only our District 7 has a problem. These aliens are really stupid." The one-eyed middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. He had changed his calm image from before. They chatted as they hurried along. It seemed that they didn't notice Dean at all. Dean quietly listened to them. They didn't hide the content of their conversation from him. It seemed that they weren't afraid of him hearing anything. Through the three of them, Dean roughly knew some of the situation. The War God's Wall was divided into 4 sides. It seemed that each side was divided into 20 districts. The 3 of them were sent by the Empire to pacify the war at the border. If the war wasn't pacified, the 3 of them would take full responsibility. Because of this, the youth wanted to forcibly recruit Dean and Felicia. Although the Abyss wasn't a big deal in the border battlefield, it wasn't a small bird either. After all, the Kingdom of God wasn't so terrible that everyone in the border guards was an Abyss. However, Felicia was backed by the Bloodthorn Sovereign, and she did not reveal what mission she was on. Although the young man with the brush cut was furious, he did not dare to force her. If it was an urgent matter, and the Bloodthorn Sovereign blamed him, even if he defended the border and made a contribution, he might still fail because of this. After all, the character of the Bloodthorn King could be seen from the title of the Bloodthorn King. As the purple-winged dragon spread its wings and soared, the great giant wall in front of Dean became clearer and clearer. The gray haze receded and appeared in his sight from small to large. This was a steep and towering giant wall. In Dean's mind, the God's Wall was already a magnificent building. In front of this towering giant wall, it suddenly lost its momentum. It was as if it was as small as a weak child. This was the real towering into the clouds. Dean was shocked. The war here was really a fight in the sky. The speed of the purple dragon was very fast. It brought them to the sky above the War God's Wall in the blink of an eye. The few of them followed the purple-winged flying dragon through the thin clouds. The moisture in the clouds brushed past their bodies, and the world above the clouds was especially dazzling. The countless clouds in the distance were like cotton candy, and also like a sprinkling ball of flour. Soon, the purple dragon plunged into the clouds. The wind whistled. In the whistling sound, Dean faintly heard a very sharp bird's cry and the rumbling of thunder. A lightning seemed to flash in his mind. It was the Thunderbird. Before he could follow the sound, the sudden acceleration of the wind forced him to grab the rope on the back of the purple dragon with one hand and pull Aisha with the other to prevent her from falling. The clouds suddenly receded and his line of sight became clear. Dean was shocked. He suddenly wondered if he had landed on the ground. In front of him was a vast flat square. There were countless soldiers stationed on it like ants. They stood like javelins, holding spears in their hands. Their military postures were neat, and their momentum was shocking. At the edge of the flat ground, Dean saw the green forest and a river. Obviously, this vast square was the top of the War God's Wall. However, the width was big enough to form a battlefield. Dean suddenly understood why the War God's Wall could protect the God's kingdom for so long. With such thickness, even if the demons of the Abyss were good at digging walls, it would take several days to destroy it. Moreover, the War God's Wall should be made of the same material as the giant wall. It was not made of ordinary rock. The Great Splitter had only left a few shallow claw marks on the War God's Wall. One could imagine the toughness of the material. Whoosh! The purple dragon quickly braked and set off a hurricane. The hats and headscarves of the soldiers on the top of the wall fluttered. The flags inserted next to them were also fluttering. Soon, several figures rushed over from afar. The leader was an old man in his 60s, wearing a dark golden armor. His hair was white, and he was not wearing a helmet. His face was stained with blood, and his armor was also stained with blood. There were pieces of flesh in between the gaps of his armor. When he saw the young man with the brush cut and the others on the flying dragon, he let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "Finally, you guys are here." The young man with the brush cut stepped on the dragon's neck and jumped down. The tall woman and the one-eyed middle-aged man followed. Dean also jumped down with them. When he and Aisha landed on the ground, the soldiers standing around suddenly looked at them. For a time, countless murderous aura quickly gathered on Dean. To be precise, it gathered on Aisha, who was next to Dean. Countless spears were pointed at them. At this moment, even Dean, who had countless bloody hands, felt a chill. These soldiers were completely different from the soldiers he had seen before. He could see through the heat source that these people were pioneers. Pioneers who were considered as masters in the God's Wall seemed to be the lowest level here. However, these people were completely different from the pioneers he had seen before. Their murderous aura was so strong that they seemed to climb out from the hell. Dean's hair stood up. He instinctively had an impulse to fight and resist. Well, the old man in his 60s frowned slightly. The soldiers around him suddenly received a message. They put away their spears and stood still. It seemed that the previous scene didn't exist at all, but the murderous aura still shrouded Dean. It seemed that once Aisha made a move, they would immediately attack. Who is this? The old man in his 60s looked at Dean with some doubts. Dean didn't seem to be a border envoy, and he had never seen him before. But he could see that the Corpse King seemed to be this young man's. Don't get me wrong. He came here temporarily when we were on the road. I heard that the situation here is critical. Seeing that he is also at the abyss level, I thought that he could help here. The young man with the brush changed his arrogant attitude and said politely to the old man. The old man suddenly understood. No wonder he felt that Dean was a bit strange. It seemed that he hadn't reached the border envoy level. What is this Corpse King? The old man asked. He brought it with him. He's going to bring it back to the kingdom of God and present it to the king. The young man with the brush didn't want to waste time on Dean. He simply said a sentence and immediately asked, "How is the situation here?" Chapter 9:30. But what? The old man sighed. I haven't seen these strange beasts before. Although there aren't many of them, but we have suffered heavy casualties. Last night, in the early hours of the morning, the sentinels in front of us sent a warning. They said that there were traces of fire dragons and a lot of beasts heading towards us. It is estimated that the beasts were driven by them. At present, the number of beasts is 2. I'm afraid that we won't be able to defend if they concentrate on attacking Area 7. That's why I sent a message to the Empire overnight to ask for reinforcements. Dean, who was quietly listening to the old man's words, was moved. Sent a message last night? Felicia said that it would take more than a month to reach the Empire from here. Didn't it mean that it only took them one night to send the message to the Empire? Or even faster? After all, if the Empire had received the message and sent people immediately, then it would take time for the 3 envoys to arrive. Thinking of the flying speed of the purple-winged dragon, Dean estimated in his heart. He felt that if there was no hindrance all the way, it would be as long as they traveled on land for more than a month. This was probably the efficiency of the Air Force. 2. Level of beasts. The youth's face changed. There was a trace of dignified look in his eyes. The old man nodded. The information we got isn't very accurate, but it is usually about 80% accurate. At present, I have sent people to patrol the front of the fortress. If there is any movement, they will immediately report back. I'm relieved that the 3 of you have come to reinforce us. If there is no accident, then we should be able to defend. The matter of border defense is an important matter. There can't be any accidents. Otherwise, it will be our dereliction of duty. The young man with the brush cut showed his attitude, and then glanced at the warriors around him. He frowned and said, There aren't many of your weird, demonic beasts. How can you cause such heavy casualties among the warriors? Is it a group of high-level monsters? The old man shook his head and smiled. In terms of combat effectiveness, they're not as good as our soldiers. But their lurking ability is extremely strong. The sentinels in front of us are not aware of them. Moreover, their bodies are poisonous and they will explode when they die. It will form a poisonous area. If more than a dozen of them explode in the same place, then the poisonous gas will be released. Many soldiers were unable to guard against it, and the poisonous gas entered their bodies. They are currently being treated by the medical team, but the situation is not very optimistic. Many soldiers have died due to the poisoning. So powerful? The young man's expression changed slightly. It was common for soldiers to be injured or poisoned, but it was a great loss if they died. These soldiers were trained with great effort. They were the most elite soldiers in the Imperial Military Department. Each of them was trained with countless resources and money. Dean was also shocked. The monsters were not as powerful as the pioneers, but they had caused so much damage to the border. Sure enough, strength was not the only criterion to judge the enemy. Many low-level monsters had more terrible soft power than the Abyss. Let's talk as we walk. The old man turned around and glanced at Dean. This young man's strength is not weak. What are you going to do? Just follow the arrangements of the other temporarily recruited soldiers. The young man said without thinking. He knew that the reason why the old man noticed Dean was not because Dean was an Abyss expert, but because he was worried that Dean was brought by them. Perhaps Dean had a close relationship with them, or perhaps he was the child of a big shot in the Empire. The old man wanted to take this opportunity to send him to the border to accumulate military achievements. Got it. The old man nodded. Since the young man said so, it meant that what he said before was not a lie. This young man was really an unlucky guy that the old man met on the road and recruited temporarily. Lisa, arrange this young man, the old man said to a tall woman in a silver-gray military uniform behind him. The woman was wearing red glasses and a military cap. Her temperament was sexy and charming, but also a bit cold and arrogant. Any man who saw her would be moved. She responded indifferently. Yes. The old man led the young man and the other two to leave the place. The rest of the people followed and surrounded them like stars around the moon. Only Dean, the female officer named Lisa, and the soldiers were left in the place. What's your name? Lisa turned to look at Dean. Dean thought for a moment and said, Dean, duty? Lisa looked at him and nodded. Come with me. Dean immediately followed her with high sha. The top of the wall of war was very wide. The inner part was the living area where the soldiers camped. The outer part was the line of defense. Some enemies who broke through the layers of attacks and climbed to the top of the wall would often be killed outside the line of defense. It was also a temporary battlefield on the wall. The ground was always filled with the smell of blood. Dean followed Lisa through the barracks. After a long time, they came to another pile of tents. There were also soldiers stationed nearby, but there were not many idle warriors. Moreover, they were different from the warriors outside the barracks that Dean passed first. Although these warriors were wandering, sitting together chatting, and even gambling, they were all wearing military uniforms and armor. It seemed that they were ready to go at any time. At first glance, the soldiers here gave off a feeling of laziness. Almost none of them wore a complete set of military armor. Some of them only wore military pants and a white shirt, looking very loose and casual. Some of them had messy hair and yawned as if they had just woken up. All the people's faces changed when they saw Lisa come over. The people who were laughing and joking immediately stopped. Soon, everyone's attention shifted to Dean and Aisha, who were following behind Lisa. Some people's eyes flashed when they saw Aisha. They seemed to be aware of something. Some people looked at Dean and Aisha with gloating eyes. Some people had sympathetic eyes. Lisa didn't pay attention to the people who were wandering outside the barracks. She went straight to a large tent in the middle of the barracks. It was very spacious inside. There was a desk at the top. A bald man was sitting on it. His feet were on the desk. He was holding a young woman in military uniform in his arms. Her snow-white hemisphere and flat abdomen were as smooth as silk. A rough hand was moving over and kneading them. The big hand was bigger than the woman's waist. It seemed that it could break her waist with one hand. Seeing Lisa come in, the two of them stopped in their passion. When the baldy looked up and saw that it was Lisa, he immediately swallowed the vulgarities that had rushed to the tip of his tongue. He said angrily, "Can't you get someone to inform us?" Lisa looked at him indifferently. "Is it necessary? Even if you are at a critical time, I can wait by the side. It's also good to watch a live performance. It's good to relieve my fatigue." Dean didn't expect that a beauty like Lisa, who looked like an iceberg, would say such tough words. Sure enough, you can't judge a person by their appearance. But he had seen a lot of people like her. These days, shy girls were much rarer than passionate Annies. The bald man rolled his eyes. He pushed the young girl away and waved his hand, motioning her to leave. The girl nodded obediently. She put on her clothes and left with small steps. When she passed by Dean, she glanced at him. She saw that Dean was also looking at her. Her cheeks turned crimson. She showed a touch of shyness and hurried away. Dean's face was calm. He knew that the shy expression on the girl's face was deliberate. In fact, some prostitutes who received countless customers could do the same. As long as there was a need, there would be a supply. Lisa casually walked to the side and sat down. She glanced at Dean, who was standing at the entrance of the tent, and said, "This is the temporary recruitment camp. What are you good at? What are the magic marks? Tell this bald man, and let him arrange suitable soldiers for you. He will be your boss in the future. Of course, he will be the second boss when I am here." The bald man's face was full of black lines, but he had long been familiar with her temperament. It wasn't the first time that such a thing happened. He ignored Lisa and asked Dean, "Look at your appearance. You should be from the abyss." "Very good." Such a level of master is rare in this temporary recruitment camp. "What is your name? Also, what is the matter with the Corpse King next to you?" He showed a more interested look, but he didn't think that the Corpse King was under Dean's control. It was too unrealistic. Dean frowned. "My name is Dean. I caught her in the wilderness. After the recruitment period is over, I will return to the Empire and give her to the king." Along the way, he heard the others call the Holy Kingdom Empire, so he also changed the way he addressed it and deliberately used the word return to hint at his identity. At present, only 3 people knew that he came out from the wall, but he felt that the 3 of them wouldn't deliberately tell others that he came out from the wall and wasn't a person of the kingdom of God. As for the accent problem, Dean thought of a lot of excuses. For example, he was sent out to perform tasks when he was a child. Also, he had internships in the wall and so on. Is it for the king? Baldy and Lisa glanced at each other slightly, but they did not show any strange expressions. Baldy nodded and said, "This Corpse King seems to be abyssal grade. To be able to capture an abyssal grade Corpse King, your ability is not small. However, Corpse Kings are easy to cultivate. There is no difference between abyssal grade and hunter grade. It should not be able to exchange for many things. Why don't you give it to me?" Dean frowned. "What are you going to do?" Baldy didn't care that Dean's tone was slightly rude. He used an expression of, "You are a man, so you should understand," and said, "Of course it is to have fun. You just came here, so you don't know how boring it is here. Drinking is prohibited and gambling can't last more than an hour. The only thing left for entertainment is women. I'm tired of playing with the girls outside. I haven't been an undead for a long time. I really miss it. I miss it." Dean's eyes flashed with a cold light. His fingers clenched but soon loosened. He lowered his head and restrained the killing intent in his body. After a moment, he slowly said, "I'm going to give her to the king. I'm afraid it won't be good if I can't send her to him." The bald man chuckled. "What are you talking about? You should have been temporarily recruited when you were out on a mission. You haven't returned to the Empire yet. How can you tell the king about this thing? Besides, why would the Sovereign King contact you? It's not a good habit to learn to lie the moment you arrive." Dean's fingers slightly trembled. He lowered his head and shook his head. "I didn't lie. The captain of the 5th Squad of the Bloodthorn Legion, Phineas, was going to recruit both of us. But she has an important task and has to go back. I mentioned it to her. She should help me report to the king. So, Phineas?" The bald man slightly frowned. He hadn't heard of this name, but it seemed that Dean wasn't lying. The smile on the bald man's face quickly disappeared. He stared at Dean while his fingers gently tapped on the table. The atmosphere in the tent seemed to be a bit depressing. If it was someone else, they would have been very nervous at this moment. But Dean was desperately restraining himself, restraining his own killing intent. How about you lend me a few days? I'll clean her up and return her to you. How about it? The bald man emphasized each word. There was silence in the tent. The silence lasted for a long time before Dean's voice came. What if I don't want to? The bald man's eyes suddenly turned cold. Just as he was about to speak, Laisha suddenly interrupted and said impatiently, Okay, let's talk business. What are you talking about? You fool around with women every day, and now you're a walking dead. Aren't you afraid that your thing will be infected or bitten by you? The coldness in the bald man's eyes faded as if nothing had happened. His face once again showed a smile. I'm just kidding. Why are you so serious? I was just joking, but the excitement of an undead is really different. You haven't experienced it yet. Besides, how can it be infected with an isolation membrane? Remember the undead I used to deal with? I broke its teeth and handed my work to it. Don't even mention how cool it was when it desperately bit me. Enough. Lisa frowned and scolded. It's not over yet. Did your sperm get to your brain? The bald man's face slightly changed as he knew that the joke had gone too far. He scratched his head. I'm just joking. Well, I won't say it. It's all your fault. You made me hold back my anger. Lisa stared at him. The bald man smiled and no longer mentioned the matter. He looked up at Dean and said in a serious tone, What is your magic mark? Tell me your specific strength so that I can arrange you into the corresponding army. Chapter 9:31. Splitter. A smile appeared on the bald man's face. It's a 3-star magic mark. TSK. It's quite rare. I remember that magic marks of a splitter are good at attacking. In that case, you can only go to the Vanguard Battalion. Lisa glanced at him. Don't you want to verify it? The bald man grinned. What is there to verify? I believe in little brother's character. You won't lie. Lisa rolled her eyes and glanced at Dean, who was silent. She slightly shook her head. His experience was too shallow. He had offended the commander of the temporary recruitment camp. If Dean had said that he had a perception-type magic mark or an investigation-type magic mark, then even if Baldy was dissatisfied with him, he wouldn't have dared to openly assign him to the assault camp in front of him. Private hatred could only be solved in private at the border. If anyone was involved in the war, then once it was detected, it would not be a small punishment. Now that Dean was assigned to the Vanguard camp, it was obvious that he could only live for a few days. Even she couldn't change anything. After all, Dean didn't have any background, so it wasn't worth her help. Dean was relieved when he saw Baldy's impatient appearance. He had gambled correctly. His vision was very accurate. He knew that if he offended the bald man, then the other side would definitely find fault with him. If he said that he had a perception-type magic mark, then the other side may not believe it. They might even ask to stimulate the demonic body on the spot to verify it. Although his demonic body was that of Splitter, but there seemed to be some differences with the average Splitter. In case they saw something wrong, then it would be more troublesome. Dean, Splitter magic marks, Abyss level. Baldy took out a book and wrote down Dean's information. Good. You have added a general to the team. You have to do a good job and kill as many enemies as you can on the battlefield. With the destructive power of your magic marks, it will be easy for you to accumulate achievements. I estimate that you will be rewarded when you return to the kingdom of God. Dean nodded, but didn't say anything. Although the bald man's words were very tempting, but his eyes and tone were obviously gloating. The Vanguard Battalion, as the name suggested, was obviously the cannon fodder that charged at the very front. While the speed at which they accumulated combat achievements was fast, the speed at which they were sacrificed was even faster. On a battlefield of this level, an Abyss like him was nothing at all. Saying that he was a general was just a joke that the enemy was joking about. As for why the Baldy was in such a good mood, Dean knew the reason. Once he died, Aisha would be ownerless. How long is the temporary conscription period? Dean asked. The bald man smiled and said, When the border guards withdraw their emergency alert state, your service time will be over. As for when the emergency alert state will be withdrawn, it will depend on when those fellows outside the border retreat. Dudian nodded and didn't say anything. Go wait outside first. I still have something to say to Commander Leisha. I'll bring you to report to the charge camp later and collect your battlefield single unit combat device. Individual combat device. Dean's eyes moved, but he didn't ask much. He turned and left. Leisha looked at Dean's back as he walked out of the tent. She slightly frowned and said to the bald man, "You haven't asked him if he is a lower or middle abyss." The baldy smiled disapprovingly and said, "I say, Miss Lisa, have you taken a fancy to this pretty boy? I noticed that the way you look at him is not right. In the past, when those guys came to report, I didn't see you pay attention to them. Moreover, do you still need to ask? If he is a middle abyss, how could he be caught and brought to our temporary conscription camp? Those people are at the same level as us and have backers in the Empire. This kid obviously has no background. He deserves to be unlucky. Who doesn't know that our temporary conscription camp is just cannon fodder on the battlefield?" Leisha's face was cold. "Pay attention to your words." The bald man saw her change her face and quickly smiled. He didn't dare to push his luck. Yes. My mouth is cheap." Leisha snorted coldly and said, "I'm warning you. We need people now. This person is an abyss after all. You better not play any tricks. Even if he dies, that corpse king won't be yours. I'll keep it safe." The bald man's expression changed slightly. His brows furrowed, but he quickly relaxed and revealed a smile again. He chuckled and said, "Miss Leisha, what are you talking about? Although this brat has a tough temper, I'm not that narrow-minded. Don't worry. Making the best use of everything is our principle here. I won't deliberately send him to his death. However, about the Corpse King, how about we discuss it later?" Lisa knew that he was a ruffian in the army. He had been here for many years and was already a wily old fox. She couldn't be bothered to lower herself to his level. She got up and said, "I'll send this person personally. Take care." After saying that, she left the tent. The bald man looked at her swaying waist and slightly licked his lips. There was a trace of greed in his eyes. He whispered to himself, "Smelly bitch. One day I'll make you beg for mercy under my crotch." Dean was waiting outside the tent. He heard the voices of the two people inside the tent. As he expected, he was surprised that the cold-faced female officer Lisa seemed to be talking to him. Both of them had almost no communication. Was this the legendary cold face but warm heart? The sound of footsteps came from behind. Dean knew that Leisha was coming. He turned and said, "Officer Leisha." Leisha nodded slightly. "Come with me." Dudian followed behind her with Haisha. The two of them passed through the tents and the surroundings and slowly distanced themselves from the crowd and the guards, coming to the inner boundary of the Battle God Wall. Looking down from here, the land on the inner boundary was extremely vast and the distance was extremely far. The rivers and forests on the ground were extremely beautiful. Leisha stood at the edge, her silky hair fluttering in the breeze. It was as light as a cloud, blurring her features. She stopped and stood there, looking into the distance. Dean's eyes lit up. He didn't know why this woman brought him here. He didn't ask. There was silence between the two. There was only a few whistling sounds of the wind. After a few minutes of silence, Leisha opened her mouth. The first sentence she said made Dean's hair stand up. "Is the Corpse King your lover?" Dean couldn't help but clench his fists. He stared at her back. Suddenly, he had an impulse to attack. But he couldn't see the slightest murderous intent from Leisha's body. He finally endured it. "What did you say?" Dean asked in a deep voice. Lisa slowly turned her head and looked at Aisha. She looked at Dean. "If I'm not wrong, then she's your lover? Or a partner who fought with you? How long has she been infected?" Dean's face became more gloomy. He stared at the woman's face. He carefully looked at every pore of her body. Suddenly, he found a sad and compassionate expression in her eyes. Was she sympathizing with him? Dean suppressed the killing intent in his heart and whispered, "Sir, you misunderstood. She is just a corpse king that I caught. You don't have to lie to me. I won't tell on you." Leisha shook her head. You won't live to see tomorrow if I want to kill you. Moreover, I won't do it myself. Do you believe me? Dean's palms overflowed with cold sweat. He naturally didn't believe it, but he had to believe it. Seeing Dean's silence, Laisha continued. I've noticed her since you came. You said that you caught her in the wilderness. Oh, that's just to deceive others. Her clothes are cleaner than yours. There's no minced meat or blood in her nails. Her nails are neatly trimmed. She often takes care of her hands, even more diligent than me. How can I believe that she isn't your lover? Dean's face changed. He didn't expect these reasons to expose him. It was meaningless to continue to deny it. He looked at her. Yes, she is my lover. What do you want? Laisha shook her head slightly. I don't want to do anything. I just have some feelings. She turned her head and looked into the distance as before. Her voice was ethereal with a bit of sadness. My husband, like her, was infected with the virus and became a corpse king. Dean was startled. I saw him being bitten with my own eyes and the virus eating away at his body bit by bit. I once knelt down and begged everyone I could to save him, but no one could do it. I could only watch as his skin turned paler day by day, and then completely changed, becoming a corpse king that didn't recognize anyone. At that time, I thought that if he became a corpse king and bit me, I could also become a corpse king and accompany him, even if it meant being destroyed. Laisha's voice floated in the breeze. But he didn't. No. Dean's pupils shrank. Laisha slowly said, he resurrected as a corpse king. He didn't bite me. Instead, he pushed me away. Then he was destroyed in front of me. Dean saw her slightly trembling shoulders and was slightly silent. It was a long silence. Lisa seemed to be calming herself down. It was not until a long time later that she finally turned around. Her expression seemed to have returned to its previous indifference, except that there was obvious moisture in her eyes. Seeing that you love her so much, I believe that you must love her very much, very deeply, and you're even willing to sacrifice yourself for her. However, keeping her by your side for such a long time is not the solution. You are now conscripted to the temporary camp. You can lose your life at any time. When you die, she won't have a good ending. If you trust me, you can entrust her to me. If you can return to the Empire alive, it will naturally be the best. If not, I can take care of her for you. At least, I won't let her be destroyed. Dean looked at the faint sadness in her eyes. Suddenly, he had a feeling of finding the same kind of confidant. The previous dialogue between her and Baldy was very clear that he would die in the battlefield this time. Although he didn't want to agree, but there would be accidents at any time. Not to mention the battlefield. Even if it was in the wilderness, there would be accidents. In case something happened to him, then Aisha would have someone to rely on. It would be a good thing. Well, if something happens to me, then please take care of her. Dean thought for a moment and nodded. I will take care of her, Laisha slowly said, but I see that she doesn't seem to have the ability to move. She can't even eat or drink. How do you limit her ability to move? Dean was about to open his mouth, but a warning sign suddenly sounded in his heart. His eyes flashed as he said, this method of restriction is less destructive to her body, but it is more cumbersome. Through some tools, her bones, body, and brain perception system are restricted from her body, so that she has no perception of the outside world. That's why she is in such a state. Laisha's eyes flashed a trace of imperceptible disappointment. So that's how it is. This method is really good. I have heard of it before in the Empire. Once the perception of the undeads is blinded, they will stop moving like puppets. They have weak thinking ability, or even none. In the case of no prey, they will basically be in a wandering state. That's it. Dean nodded. It's a bit complicated. Let's go and report first. I'll tell you the details later. Laisha nodded slightly and sighed. All right. She turned back to the aisle and led Dean all the way forward. Dean was behind her. Looking from the side, he could see her shoulders and chest bulge. The beautiful face seemed to have restored the usual indifference. He slightly frowned. He didn't know whether this woman was really like what she said or had another purpose. If there was another purpose, did she realize that the state of his control of Aisha was different from the General Corpse King? So, she wanted to find out from his hands? If that was the case, Why didn't she report it? The Empire should have a means to pry open a person's mouth. Thinking of this, Dean suddenly felt that this woman was not as simple as she looked on the surface. Perhaps she was not just the deputy of the old general. Not long after the two walked, they came to a military camp next to the temporary enlistment camp. There were only 20 or 30 tents here. Hundreds of people were moving around and inside the tents. Most of them were pioneers, followed by a larger proportion of dominators. In addition, Dean also saw 2 abyss-level heat sources. As for whether there were abyss-level heat sources or not, he didn't know. This is the assault camp. Leisha introduced and led Dean to the largest tent in the middle. People sitting or chatting around saw Leisha and Dean like sharks smelling blood. Although they maintained their original posture, their eyes were all focused on the two. Leisha lifted the curtain and walked in. It was very spacious inside, full of weapons such as swords, spears, etc. On the other side, there were several huge metal racks with armors similar to wrist guards. There were several people working in the tent. A fat woman sat at the top table. She was less than 5 meters tall, but her horizontal width was almost no less than 1 meter. She belonged to the kind of person who wouldn't feel pain if she fell. She looked up and was surprised. "Officer Leisha, this is the newcomer, Dean, an abyss-level master." Leisha pointed at Dean and said to the short and fat woman, "Prepare a set of armor and an individual soldier system for him." Abyss? The short and fat woman was a little surprised. She looked at Dean and soon noticed Aisha next to him. She was startled and said, "This is a Corpse King, his trophy." Leisha said casually. The short and fat woman understood and didn't ask again. "I know. I'll tailor it for him." "All right, I'll leave him to you. I have to go back first. The 3 border envoys have arrived. I'll go and see how they're going to deal with this matter." Leisha turned and left. She gave Dean a careful look before leaving. The short and fat woman looked at Dean after Leisha left. "Dean, I'll remember it. You wait outside and come back to collect your combat equipment." Dudian was surprised. Combat equipment? Doesn't everyone have a magic hunting device? Chapter 9:32. "Of course," the short and fat woman said, as if it was a matter of course. "Fighting with a demonic body alone is just like us humans taking off our clothes to fight. Although some people's demonic body is extremely defensive and even tougher than high-grade military armor, if you add a set of combat armor on the outside, it is equivalent to a double defense. And for those who are perceptive or good at hiding, life-saving, and other magic mark abilities, combat armor is even more useful." Dudian nodded. "But don't worry about not being able to wear it. Miss Lisa said that the combat armor is tailor-made. It is completely suitable for the transformation of the demonic body. What is your magic mark? Tell me." The short and fat woman took out a small book and asked. "Splitter." Dudian answered truthfully. The plump woman scribbled a few notes on the notebook and then threw the notebook back on the table. She walked up to the metal rack with the black wrist guard hanging on it. "This is your soldier's auxiliary individual combat system. It's a little different from the equipment, you know." She took one from the shelf and threw it to Dudian. Dudian raised his hand to catch it. He was stunned when he looked down. It was not a wrist guard. It was a bit like a wristwatch, but it was wider. There was a display screen on top of it. Put it on the hand that you rarely use in combat. If you're right-handed, put it on your left hand. If you're left-handed, put it on your right hand to prevent it from being damaged in battle. Although this thing is very hard, the display board on it is not, the short and fat woman said. Dudian's eyes flashed. He seemed to think of something, but he was not sure. He did as he was told and put on his left hand. At this time, the short and fat woman came over. First, she checked if he had put it on properly and helped him tighten it. Then, she stretched out her chubby fingers, which were trimmed to the point like sharp claws, and gently tapped on the side of the display board. Soon, the display board lit up. Dean's conjecture was confirmed, and he couldn't help but be stunned. The chunky woman saw Dean's reaction and gently smiled. Many people who came to the border for the first time were surprised by the auxiliary combat system. After all, they had only seen the light in the flame and the starry sky above their heads. The display board was blue. In less than 4 or 5 seconds, the background slowly turned green, and then a white grid appeared. In the center of the grid, there was a green dot, and beside the green were densely packed yellow dots. Dean stared blankly and seemed to be in a daze. His reaction was completely within the short and fat woman's expectations. She explained, as the name suggests, this auxiliary combat system is a device to help you fight on the battlefield. This grid is a map, and each grid is 1 kilometer long. The grid at the outermost edge is thinner, and when you move there, the grid will return to the size of the central area. The green dot above is you. The surrounding yellow dots are our allies. If there's a red dot above, it's the enemy. The enemy is an alien race or a demon. It's also possible that it's a human who isn't equipped with a personal combat system. Dean came back to his senses and nodded slightly. He didn't say anything, but there was an indescribable, complex feeling in his heart. He was surprised and worried at the same time. But in the end, he was surprised. Electricity. The God Kingdom had mastered electricity, and it was even being used on the battlefield. Moreover, it wasn't just electricity, but a deeper application of magnetic field. This was enough to show that the technology mastered by the God Kingdom was far higher than he had expected. Mastering electricity was the real difference between the ancient and the modern. Once the God Kingdom mastered electricity, it meant that if the God Kingdom found the relics of the old era, they would be able to use it directly. Moreover, electricity would be of great help to the promotion of industrial reform. It would greatly improve the speed of human scientific and technological progress. Dean could feel that it wouldn't be a short time before the Kingdom of God mastered the power of the individual combat system. For him, the more advanced the technology of the God Kingdom was, the greater the hope of resurrecting Aisha. But he was worried that in the future he would go to the God Kingdom with advanced technology. The advantage of the super chip in his hands would be weak. However, he believed that even if it was weak, it wouldn't be too weak. At worst, he could skip the electrical revolution. After the electrical revolution, there was the third industrial revolution. It was the era of science and technology. The rise of a series of technologies, such as biological cloning technology and aerospace technology, was enough to bring earth-shaking changes to the world. Moreover, he had the strongest weapon in his hands, nuclear weapons. However, when it came to cloning technology, Dean couldn't help but think of the temple in the Barker's wall. By cutting out the original body of the parasitic soulworm and mixing it with the origami factor, it seemed to be called biological cloning technology. In this abnormal era, the technology seemed to be somewhat abnormal. There were some things that the God Kingdom had mastered after the Third Industrial Revolution. After all, the old era wasn't completely destroyed. There were a lot of relics left behind. There were crystallization of human wisdom. It wasn't uncommon for the God Kingdom to bring abnormal growth in technology. It was even possible for the God Kingdom to create nuclear reactors. However, the probability of this was low. After all, the nuclear weapons technology was the secret of the God Kingdom. The possibility of carelessly leaving the technology in the relics was not high. When did the Empire create this auxiliary combat system? Dean recovered from his thoughts and asked her. The short and fat woman was surprised. She didn't expect that Dean wouldn't ask about the magic of this thing, but about its age. She frowned. "Why are you asking about this? It's not something you should care about." Dean replied, "I'm curious. The Empire is too powerful. It's amazing that they could create such a magical thing. So I want to know when the Empire created it. Is it possible that they created it hundreds of years ago? The people who made these things are amazing." His face was filled with admiration and heartfelt admiration. Seeing his appearance, the short and fat woman chuckled and said, "Needless to say, this is the masterpiece of the temple. It was created more than 120 years ago. This is already the improved 5th-generation combat system. It is more advanced than the previous ones. Not only can it sense the position of allies and enemies, but can also communicate temporarily within a certain range." She stretched out her chubby finger and pressed on the only slightly raised black particle next to the display board. The display board suddenly fluctuated like an audio frequency. Hello, hello. The short and fat woman approached the display board to test the sound. Her voice echoed from the front edge of the combat system, but after the electric current processing, it sounded more pleasant and younger. Dean was startled. He didn't expect that the radio system had been developed by the kingdom of God. Don't be surprised. It's called instant communication. It's one of the abilities to assist the individual combat system. The short and fat woman thought that Dean was scared. On the battlefield, you can use this to contact your allies on the same channel. But the range of the allies can't be too far. Next, she gave Dean a detailed introduction of the various functions inside. Dean found that this thing contained a lot of technology. In addition to life detection and radio, there was temperature and terrain display. It could be debugged and displayed on the grid. Moreover, it was completely waterproof. Even if it was soaked in water for a few days, it wouldn't be a problem. It could be used for a month if the radio wasn't used frequently. Remember, no matter what the situation is, you can't abandon this thing. You can't take it off even if you want to take a bath. Of course, there's no condition for you to take a bath here. The short and fat woman solemnly looked at Dean and warned him in a serious tone. Even if your arm is cut off on the battlefield, you must pick it up. Otherwise, the other allies' combat system will show your position. They will reinforce you and put you in danger. If you lose this thing, you will face the heaviest military punishment except death. I guarantee that it will be more painful than death. Dean nodded slightly, but in his heart, he thought that preventing the allies from saving him was secondary. Most of the time, it was to use this to see their position. It was to prevent people from avoiding the battle or even killing each other. On the battlefield, unless it was a soldier who had graduated from military school, people like Dean, who had to rely on themselves to climb up, would not save others in a situation of their own safety. It was tantamount to finding trouble for himself. As for the situation of his own safety, it was needless to say that he couldn't protect himself. It would be good if he didn't drag others down with him. Well, it's none of your business. You can go. I'll ask someone to send your combat armor to you. The short and fat woman waved her hand to send Dean away. Dean turned around and left with Aisha. Outside the tent, there was a short-haired young officer who also had a buzz cut. 9 out of 10 soldiers here had a buzz cut. Short hair was more convenient in battle. This was the experience concluded by the veterans. In a prolonged battle, the hair would be mixed with the enemy's blood or even internal organs. It was very likely that the hair would fall down and touch the eyes or even block the vision. Therefore, a buzz cut perfectly eliminated such potential dangers. Of course, the old-era soldiers didn't shave their hair for such a bloody reason. Are you new? Come with me. I'll take you to your residence, the young officer said stiffly. He seemed serious and indifferent. Dean nodded. The young officer took Dean to a tent about 100 meters away. The tent was rectangular, more than 20 meters long and 10 meters wide. It was a medium-sized tent here, but it was also extremely spacious. There were 40 beds in it, divided into 4 rows, with 10 beds in each row. At the moment, many of the beds were occupied. There were clothes and some small parts piled up on the beds, such as a monster's skull, claws, for pillows, and so on. Dean glanced around. There was nothing but 6 beds with uniform quilts. There were 34 people living here. Including him, there were 35 people. Without exception, all 35 people were men. It was estimated that the women were assigned to women's tents. The young officer led Dean into the tent and said, "You can pick any of the empty beds here. Remember, don't cause trouble here, or else you will be punished by military law. In addition, if there is an announcement outside, be sure to gather in the square within 10 seconds. Do you know where the square is?" Asked the others. He turned around and left as if he had completed his task. After he left, Dean turned his head and saw many people in the tent looking up at him. To be precise, they were looking at Aisha, who was next to him. Greed, evil desire, naked eyes, without the slightest concealment. Dean's face turned cold. He took Aisha to an empty bed inside the tent. After a few steps, a leg stretched out from the second row on the right. It was the first bed on the side of the aisle that Dean passed through, blocking his way. "Buddy, how's the matter I discussed with you?" The owner of the leg was a thin young man in his late 20s. There was a fire scar on his face, which looked a bit scary. "At the moment," he said with an excited smile on his face. Dean stopped for a moment. Everyone's eyes showed a playful look. Dean lowered his head and seemed to be afraid to speak. But no one knew that his eyes stayed on the young man's leg. Only the young man felt it, but he laughed even more. He didn't mean to take back his leg. Then he found that he could no longer take it back. Without any warning, the outstretched leg broke at the knee with a snap. When the leg fell to the ground, blood gushed out. The cut surface was very neat. The young man was stunned for a moment. The pain passed to his brain. He immediately screamed and rolled on the bed while holding the broken leg. His face was full of pain. He stared at Dean and suddenly shouted, "Murder! Someone is killing." Others followed. Some people laughed. Some people frowned and seemed to be thinking about something. Soon, footsteps came from outside. The young officer who had just left came back. At the same time, there was an officer of similar age next to him. The two came together and lifted the tent. They immediately saw the scene in front of Dean and the young man rolling on the bed. What's the matter?" The young officer who had sent Dean was furious. He immediately came forward and scolded. At the same time, he looked at Dean angrily. At this moment, Dean was standing in front of the broken leg. Obviously, it was Dean who did it. Dean looked calm and said in a cold voice, "He provoked me first. I defended myself." Hearing Dean's words, the young man was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He immediately held back the scream and cried to the young officer, "Sir, you have to help me. He didn't do anything. I just wanted to discuss something with him. He attacked me." Everyone saw it with their own eyes. If you don't believe me, you can ask everyone. Isn't that right? Yes, this newcomer is too arrogant. It's just a question, but he actually sneak attacked. Despicable. Suddenly, someone joined in the uproar. Chapter 9:33. Is that so? The young officer's face was gloomy as he looked at Dean coldly. Dean looked indifferent. Of course not. He maliciously provoked me and was ready to attack me with his feet. I defended myself, but I didn't expect him to be so weak. I thought he was an abyss like me. As a result, I used too much force and his legs were broken. Hearing Dean's words, the people who were originally heckling were surprised. Many people looked at Dean in surprise. They didn't expect him to be an abyss. Most of the people living here were pioneers. There were abyss-level masters, but very few of them. So everyone mistakenly thought that Dean was also a pioneer or at most a dominator. For a time, the heckling voice suddenly died down, but there were still 7 or 8 people echoing. It seemed that they were purely watching the fun and were not afraid of Dean. Everyone had a different feeling when they heard the same sentence. Others understood the power exposed in Dudian's words, but the young officer heard a kind of arrogance and threat. What happened to the Abyss? Abyss can casually attack others? The young officer snorted, "He's just a pioneer. How dare he attack you? I've just told you not to make trouble. Did you ignore my words?" Dean's eyes flashed coldly as he looked straight at him. Because he is a pioneer, he doesn't know my strength and rashly provoked me. Otherwise, how can I, an Abyss, casually lower myself to the level of a pioneer? He didn't attack me, so why would I attack him? Bold, the young officer shouted. Dean's consecutive rhetorical questions made him even angrier. I brought so many newcomers here and nothing happened. Why did someone provoke you when you came? How do I know the reason? Dean knew that it was because of Aisha, but he didn't want to point it out. He knew that even if he didn't point it out, the young officer should be aware of it. His current attitude was just to establish his majesty. However, if he really let the young officer use him to establish his military prestige, then there would be a lot of trouble in the future. Moreover, these troubles were not aimed at him. You can't tell me the reason. It's your fault. Come with me to the military training office to receive punishment, the young officer said sullenly. Dean didn't move, but looked at him. I have already told you the reason, but you don't accept it. Nothing happened before because I came here, but now something happened. Am I responsible? What is the truth of the matter? You can ignore it? How could he judge who was right and who was wrong just by comparing the past and the present? Since that's the case, I'd like to ask you the same question. There are more than 30 people here. Why didn't I attack anyone but him? The young officer was slightly stifled. He didn't expect Dean to be so eloquent and articulate. He choked on the spot. Although they were both abyss-level powerhouses, but the young officer was different from the other leaders of the Giant Wall. Those people were in charge of the Giant Wall and were good at talking. The young officer was sent to the War God's Wall to guard the border. He had learned how to hunt monsters since childhood. He came here to learn how to attack alien races. How could he compare with Dudian when it came to talking? Unable to refute, he flew into a rage out of humiliation and shouted, "Sophistry! No matter what, the two of you who caused trouble this time, follow me to the military training center to receive your punishment." "Sir, I'm innocent," the young man with the broken leg said pitifully. "Shut up." The young officer's face was gloomy. "Don't think that I don't know what's going on. If you talk again, I'll cut off your other leg. You haven't learned anything else, but always cause trouble. You don't know the strength of others." The young man with the broken leg's face changed. He didn't dare to say more. In fact, he had panicked when he knew that Dean was an abyss. He had been here for so long, and he knew how cruel it was here. Although the young officer said that he would punish Dean, but at most it was symbolic. After all, they were in need of manpower. On the contrary, he was a pioneer. Even if the investigation was as he said and Dean maliciously attacked him, he could only accept it. He would receive the same punishment, but the punishment for pioneers in Abyss was as different as heaven and earth. Dean looked at the young officer and didn't say anything more. Seeing that things had calmed down, the young officer looked at the people around him who were still stretching their heads to watch the show. He shouted, "Are you all free? Gather at the training field in 3 minutes. Today, if you don't practice the knife formation, you will suffer." Many people immediately shrank their heads and cursed their bad luck. "You two, come with me." The young officer's anger hadn't dissipated. He shouted at Dean and turned to leave. Dean followed them with Aisha. The young man with the broken leg immediately picked up the broken leg from the ground. As long as the leg was still there, he could reconnect it to the medical center. He could bandage the broken leg and quickly stop the bleeding. He took out his hunting tool from under the bed and used it as a crutch to follow the young officer. He hadn't walked out of the tent when he heard a burst of laughter and ridicule from behind. The young man with the broken leg's face turned green and white. He gritted his teeth and walked out of the tent. In the military training tent of the assault camp, an old blonde general with thick eyebrows glanced at the young officer after listening to the young officer's statement. Then he looked at Dean and Aisha and finally glanced at the young officer. "Didn't you tell them that he is an abyss when you took him to report?" The young officer was surprised. His palms overflowed with cold sweat. He bowed his head and said, "Sir, it's my fault. It's good to admit your mistake, but it's better not to make mistakes." The blonde general's voice was calm as he slowly said, "You know what kind of place it is? To put it bluntly, it is a group of mobs. When they lack women, even if you give them a sow, it will be played to death, let alone undead." "Yes, sir, this subordinate knows his mistake." The young officer bowed his head. The blonde general didn't pay attention to him anymore. He looked at Dean and the young man with the broken leg and sighed. "You don't even know the strength of the enemy, but you rashly provoked them. I really don't know how a person like you mixed up to the pioneer level. Is it because you have been here for a long time without women and entertainment that your brain is stuffed with shit?" The young man with the broken leg was red. He gritted his teeth and lowered his head. He didn't dare to complain and mention the broken leg to gain sympathy. He at least had a little insight. He knew that doing so would only make him more humble and more disgusted. You take the initiative to stir up trouble. If it was in normal times, you should receive 100 lashes. Considering the current situation, the punishment will be retained, but 100 points will be deducted from your battle record. In addition, you will have to wash everyone's clothes for a week, including underwear and socks. The blonde general indifferently said. The young man with the broken leg was stunned. He didn't expect the punishment to be so heavy. He did not think about the 100 military lashes that had been delayed. Just the deduction of 100 military lashes and the fact that he had to wash other people's socks and underwear was enough to make him feel extremely pained. The people here were all conscripted at the last minute. They were not like the people who had graduated together with them in the military academy, where there was a sense of camaraderie. This place was no different from a prison, just that their range of activity was a little wider. He wouldn't be able to lift his head in the tent if he had to wash socks and underwear for others. He would be ridiculed by everyone. Sir, he opened his mouth and wanted to beg. But the blonde general's eyes made him forget the words that were about to come out of his mouth. He was stunned for a moment. The blonde general looked at Dean. You said that the Corpse King is your trophy. During the training period, hand it over to the military storage for safekeeping. Wait until the end of the battle to collect, sir. Dean frowned as he saw the sharpness in the old general's eyes. But he was a person who had seen great winds and waves. He quickly restored his composure. Miss Lisa has allowed me to carry my things with me. This is a gift to be handed over to the Bloodthorn King. I hope you can accommodate me. The blonde general saw that Dean was not afraid. He slightly frowned. He didn't get angry because of Dean's interruption. He pondered for a moment. In that case, you will be responsible for all the troubles caused by the Corpse King in the future. Are you willing? Yes. Dean knew that he had no choice. All right, go. The blonde general waved his hand. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect to be criticized, although he expected that he wouldn't be heavily punished, but he didn't think that it would be so light. His understanding of this place became clearer. Who said that the military law was strict? Treat everyone equally? There are differences in treatment everywhere. This place was no exception. However, he was in a good mood because he wasn't punished. No one wanted to suffer. The young man with the broken leg was stunned. Was it over? Wasn't he going to be punished? How come he didn't need to wash the socks and underwear? Why should I be punished? What are you doing? Get out. The young officer saw that the young man was in a daze. The young man with the broken leg slightly gritted his teeth. His heart was unwilling, but he could only carry his broken leg and limped away. Dean walked past him like a gust of wind. After all, 2 legs were faster than one. The young man with the broken leg gritted his teeth, but he could only endure. He turned to the young officer. Sir, can I get my leg treated first? In case it takes too long and can't be healed. I'm afraid I'll become a burden on the battlefield. I also want to serve the Empire. The young officer frowned but nodded. Come with me. They turned and left in another direction. Dean returned to the tent with Aisha. The tent was empty when he came in. Most of them were gathered on the training ground. Chapter 9:34. 2 hours later, people returned to the tent. They whispered and talked about the military. The tent was lifted and someone came in. Soon they noticed Dean in the tent and were surprised to see him. Hey, wasn't he punished? Why is he still here? What about the unlucky guy? Some people whispered curiously. These people returned to their respective beds. Their eyes quickly fell on the raised bedding next to Dean. Although the bedding was fluffy, they could still see that there was a person hidden inside. It should be the Corpse King that Dean had brought before. The tent gradually became lively as more and more people returned to the camp. Many people looked at the quilt next to Dean from time to time. Their eyes flashed, but they endured it. It could be seen from the fact that Dean returned so quickly that the punishment was not big. On the contrary, no one had seen the figure of the person who stood out. It was inevitable that people would speculate about his fate. I heard that you are the Abyss. A warm voice echoed as Dean closed his eyes and rested on the bed. Dean slightly opened his eyes and saw a blond man. He was handsome and had gentle eyebrows. His blue eyes were like the ocean. He didn't have the slightest hostility. Instead, he felt a sense of familiarity. You too? Dean looked at him. Just like you, my name is Zash. The golden-haired man chuckled. You haven't received your combat armor yet, right? The military armor here is quite different from the ones we've seen before. Honestly speaking, the things used for border defense are all of the best quality. No one dares to skimp on the work. Dean didn't refuse as he saw him take the initiative to strike up a conversation. He accompanied him and chatted casually. While they were chatting, the people around them looked over from time to time with solemn expressions. When they were almost done chatting, Zaxi very naturally changed the topic and said, "Have you seen the foreign races outside the borders? I'm talking about the fire dragons." Dean's eyes lit up. "Have you seen them? I've only seen them from afar." Zash's eyes were complicated, "But I don't want to see them again." The chatter around him weakened as he spoke. Many people pricked up their ears to listen. Zaxi had never talked about this before. They didn't expect that he would mention it to a newcomer like Dean. It was obvious that the other party had the strength of the abyss. Many people were envious, jealous, and longing for it. "Is it that terrifying?" Dean raised his eyebrows. "It's not terrifying." Zaxi shook his head slightly and sighed. "It's just that its appearance, that feeling, makes me very uncomfortable. I feel disgusted from the bottom of my heart. Just from its appearance alone, I can't see it clearly, but it should be as its name suggests. It's an extremely good flammability. Its entire body is burning with flames, and its speed is extremely fast." "Is it stronger than the abyss?" Dean asked. Zash shook his head. "It should be the same as the abyss. Anyway, I haven't fought against it, but I don't think I will win if I fight against it." Dean was silent. Previously, Felicia had mentioned that the trolls would have the strength of the abyss once they reached adulthood. It seemed that the fire dragons weren't bad either. "Have you been here for a long time?" Dean turned the topic back to him. Zash shook his head. "Just a month. But I've been sick of looking at corpses for the past month." "Speaking of which, were you caught from the Empire or from the outside world?" "I bumped into him halfway and caught him." Dean sighed. "You are really unlucky." "Ah." Both of them chatted for a while before Zash left and returned to his bed. After all, it was the first time they met, so they didn't talk too much. Not long after, the young man with the broken leg returned to the tent. His face was ashen, and he still had half of his leg broken. He held the broken leg in his hand and looked as if he had lost his soul. Dean glanced at him and understood the reason. There was a trace of indifference in his eyes. The person on the bed next to the young man with a broken leg was surprised. "Why didn't you go to the medical office?" The young man with a broken leg staggered back to his bed. He was still in a daze. The person on the bed next to him pushed him with his magic hunting stick. The young man came back to his senses and looked at his friend. He suddenly felt like crying. Soon he thought of something. He looked back and saw Dean. There was a trace of hatred in his eyes. "What happened to you?" The person next to him frowned. The young man with a broken leg gritted his teeth. "The doctor said that my leg can't be treated." "What?" The person next to him was stunned. "How is it possible?" "The medical skills here are advanced. Broken legs and hands can be easily treated. Why can't your leg be treated?" The young man with a broken leg clenched his fists. "The doctor said that the peripheral tissues were completely damaged when my leg was cut open. It can't be healed with ordinary drugs unless I use some special drugs. But those drugs are very expensive. They're used on generals and high officials. I can only buy them with my own war points. I need at least 10,000 war points." 10,000 war points? The person next to him was stunned. "So expensive? Doesn't that mean you—" He didn't finish his words, but the meaning was obvious. "You're useless." The young man with a broken leg gritted his teeth and didn't speak. After a long time, he didn't hear the person next to him. He couldn't help but look up. He saw that the person had returned to his bed and was chatting with others. It seemed that the person had completely forgotten about him. After knowing that Dean was the abyss, the people in the tent were a lot more obedient in front of Dean. They didn't dare to take the initiative to provoke him. Especially when the news about the young man with a broken leg spread, no one dared to provoke Dean. What a joke. The injury caused by the broken leg couldn't be healed. Even if it was a broken leg, it was equivalent to a fatal injury. However, the military punishment was only based on the broken leg. Who dared to provoke Dean? On the second day after Dean entered the camp, he went to the training ground with the others to practice the military formation. They rehearsed according to the assigned positions. Today's battle was still a cold weapon war. The importance of the military formation was great. The military formation composed of 10 pioneers could be comparable to the destructive power of 20 pioneers, or even stronger. However, on the third day after Dean entered the camp, on the other side of the God of War's wall, a loud horn and a loud bell suddenly sounded. Chapter 9:35. Thunderbird. Thunderbirds are alarmed. Is there a flying monster? The horn has sounded. It's time to go to war. Everyone looked up at the golden birds flying over their heads. The feathers of these birds were flashing with purple lightning. They were extremely fast like golden auroras. In the blink of an eye, they went into the clouds in front of them. The rumbling sound was getting farther and farther as they rushed towards the world outside the war god's wall. While the crowd was discussing, two military officers quickly ran over from afar and said a few words to the instructor who was guiding the crowd in their battle formation practice. Very quickly, the instructor turned around and raised the assembly flag in his hand. He shouted, "Assemble, prepare for battle. Return to camp in 1 minute. Put on your combat armor and the single soldier support combat system. Assemble here. Those who missed this spot, be careful." He waved the flag, and everyone immediately scattered and rushed towards the tent. Dean's heart sank. He didn't expect the war to come so fast. He wasn't fully prepared, but he had to bite the bullet. He flew over the heads of others at the fastest speed and rushed into the tent. He took out the combat armor from the bed and put it on. As for the combat system, he had worn it on his wrist. His combat armor had been sent yesterday. It had a strange shape, and there were many holes on the surface. Dean had seen the positions of these holes. They were similar to the positions of the sharp blades when he entered Splitter's body. But that was before. Since he had absorbed the flesh and blood of the origami, his body had undergone a lot of changes. Sharp blades had grown in some places where there were no sharp blades. Once the blades entered the Splitter's body, they would immediately tear the combat armor. Dean had tried the toughness of the armor. He had to use all his strength to cut it. It was a relatively good defensive armor. Although he felt that it was useless to wear it, Dean still wore it. If it was torn in the battlefield, he would say that it was damaged during the battle. Anyway, it was impossible to create satellites to monitor their every move in space. Dean put on a thin animal coat and a combat armor. He picked Aisha up from the bed and took her back to the square. The whole action was done in one go. It had only been 53 seconds since they arrived at the square, but there were still a lot of people rushing over. The instructor noticed that Aisha was in Dean's arms. He frowned. "What is this?" Dean immediately said, "This is the Corpse King. If the situation is critical, I can lift the restrictions on her body and throw her into the middle of the enemy. It will give us more opportunities." "Nonsense," the instructor shouted. "This is a war, not a child's play. During a battle, how could you have the time to remove her restrictions? Even if you did, what if she pounced on your own people? Take her back immediately," Dean said. "If the enemy doesn't break through our encirclement, she will stay in place and won't cause us any trouble. But if the enemy breaks through the encirclement, then it will be good for us. I promise that once the restriction is lifted, she will be sent to the center of the enemy. At that time, the enemy may attack her. We will have more opportunities to annihilate the enemy." "Nonsense. I told you to take her back," the instructor shouted. "If you don't listen to me, then I will kill her now." Dean's eyes were gloomy. He looked at him coldly. "Now we are short of people. The situation is urgent. One more Corpse King to help us fight. Can't you even distinguish this point?" "Bold." The instructor was furious. He had always been grumpy. Some people were clumsy when he commanded Dean's temporary army. He had overdrawn his patience. Now Dean contradicted him. He was about to stride forward when he was suddenly pulled by the officer next to him. The officer whispered a few words and looked at Dean at the same time. When he finished, the instructor's face was slightly angry. He snorted, "If the situation is not urgent, I won't spare you. The Corpse King will be sent to the Undead Division. They will push her to the front line of the battlefield. You will gather and hold the line of defense given to you by the officer. Anyone who dares to retreat will be killed on the spot according to the military law." Dean frowned. He quickly understood. Push her to the front line of the battlefield? Obviously, there were a lot of undead gathered at the border. They used her as a bomb type of throwing range weapon. However, if they really pushed Aisha to the front line of the battlefield, then even if her strength was close to the middle abyss, it would be difficult for her to survive. It would be difficult to keep her corpse intact. Only I know how to restrict her body. It is useless to send her to the undead division. She will only become a grass target. I will take her to the battlefield and control her. I won't let her hurt our allies. Dean said calmly. You. The instructor was infuriated. He had never seen such disobedient soldiers. However, he also knew that these temporary recruits were a motley crew. They all had their own minds and thoughts. It would be a fool's dream to gather their wills together. On the battlefield, the will of the army couldn't be unified. It was a scattered sand. That was why the temporary army could only serve as cannon fodder. At this time, the vast and long horn sound echoed in the distance again. Everyone's eardrums buzzed, and their blood seemed to boil. The instructor and the two officers next to him changed their faces. The instructor turned to look at Dean. His eyes flashed with coldness. He clenched his fists. Boy, if there's a problem on the battlefield, I will be the first to make you look good. Dean was relieved. It seemed that he had agreed to it. He knew that the battlefield ahead was extremely dangerous, but he still felt that it was safer to bring Aisha with him. Although the people in the tent had gathered here and were going to the front of fight, but the people on the God of War's wall weren't just the people in his tent. There were also many soldiers, reserve troops, and many senior officials. He would rather die together with Aisha in the battle. He didn't want to suffer for the rest of his life. You, where's your combat armor? The instructor didn't look for trouble with Dean. His eyes swept over the gathered people. Soon he saw a short youth who didn't wear combat armor. The short youth's face turned pale. He said in a trembling voice, I don't know where my combat armor is. I put it on my bed. I just want to look for it. Waste. The instructor scolded angrily, and his thunderous gaze swept across the others. Needless to say, there must be someone who had a grudge against this short youth and was deliberately making use of this opportunity to mess with him. However, this kind of scheming and plotting against each other would have been fine on a normal day, but at this critical moment, it still appeared. This made him even angrier. Let's go. The instructor looked at the number of people. He saw that no one was missing. He immediately waved his hand and then led the way with the two officers next to him. Dean and others lined up in a square formation and followed closely behind. Soon, everyone crossed the center line of the war god's wall and came to the other side of the wall. There were many military equipment with strange shapes. There was a metal platform that looked like a huge bow and arrow, as well as a fully metal chariot. There were bright lines drawn on the ground with paint. It was like a car's guiding line on the highway. It was also used to distinguish and guide people. Everyone followed one of the guiding lines to the other side of the war god's wall. The vast world outside the wall suddenly appeared in front of everyone's eyes. This was the first time that Dean could clearly see the scenery outside the wall. It was like a fairyland under the white clouds, but it was like a scene of purgatory on Earth. There were many corpses near the war god's wall. There were humans and monsters. The color of the soil had turned dark brown. When the wind blew from above, a strong smell of blood assailed the nostrils. This smell of blood wasn't the smell of rust of fresh blood. It was a mixture of extremely fishy and rancid odor. There was also the stench of feces and other foul smells. Even Dean, who was a veteran of hunting all year round, felt stomach discomfort and wanted to vomit after smelling this stench. How many souls were piled up under this towering wall? They wanted to come in and they wanted to go out. In the blurred area in front of the war god's wall, there were a large number of troops and various military facilities. At this moment, there was a faint sound of restlessness coming from the distant white area. Go down, the instructor shouted and stepped onto a steam-powered airship with the other two officers. The steam-powered airship was docked next to the war god's wall. It was obviously a product of the kingdom of God. Although they had produced a single soldier system and mastered electricity, the steam-powered airship didn't seem to be obsolete. There was a long row of 20 to 30 airships docked next to the war god's wall. Dean and the others boarded the airship in turn under the instructor's reprimand. There were a total of 37 people sitting in 10 steam-powered airships. Under the push of the pilot, they slowly descended from the war god's wall. The steam-powered airship stopped behind several large phalanxes in front. Dean got off the airship and looked back. There was a strong sense of impact. The war god's wall was too majestic. Especially when standing under its feet, the impact was even stronger. Within 300 to 500 meters of the war god's wall, the soil was messy. With a casual sweep, one could see scattered fingers, eyeballs, and other tissues that hadn't been cleaned up. The giant wall below the war god's wall was dark brown in color and was stained with an unknown amount of blood. At this time, the instructor took Dean and the others along a straight path, all the way through those large phalanxes. These phalanxes were standing straight and dignified. At first glance, one could tell that they were regular troops. Before long, the instructor took Dean and the others to a towering fortress. This fortress was 400 to 500 meters high. It was built with boulders and wood. It was covered with people and a lot of flags. The instructor led everyone to the left side of the fortress. There were several small phalanxes that had been arranged neatly. However, compared to the large phalanxes behind them, their momentum was obviously lacking. There were also temporary conscripted troops like Dean and the others. The instructor led everyone to the side of the small phalanxes. Then he trotted to the front of the 3 officers wearing a sword mark badge on their shoulders. He raised his hand to salute and then reported. One of the officers said a few words to the instructor. The instructor returned to the front of Dean and the others. It seemed that he was their leader. Dean's eyes flashed as he looked at the instructor's back in the crowd. It seemed that the phalanxes had already gathered here. At the moment, they were discussing in low voices. From this point, it could be seen that there was a difference between the regular army and the miscellaneous army. However, their voices were very low. No officer shouted to stop them. It seemed that they were too lazy to lower themselves to the level of the temporary army. At this time, a youth who was close to the instructor asked in a low voice, "Don't we have war god's wall? Why do we have to come out to fight? Isn't it better to use the war god's wall for defense?" The instructor turned his head and glanced at him. When he saw that the instructor was a ruler, the impatience in his eyes lessened a little. He coldly snorted, "Use your brains more. The battle god rampart is our strongest line of defense, but there's a limit to the number of people it can accommodate. If the demonic creatures from outside the battle god rampart were to rush up in one go and kill their way through our encirclement, wouldn't they be able to charge into the rampart?" The youth was puzzled. In that case, why not set up a few more lines of defense inside the wall? "How do you know that there is no such thing?" the instructor asked. The youth was speechless. Indeed, he didn't see it, but it didn't mean that there was no such thing. At this time, the tsunami-like horn sounded again. It was coming from the top of the fortress. After the horn ended, a burst of urgent bell rang. In the distance, several officers with sword medals on their shoulders had a solemn expression. They immediately issued an order for all the warriors of the assault camp to immediately go up the fortress's defensive line. When the instructor heard the order, he immediately led Dean and the others up the steep stairs behind the fortress. They ran all the way to the top of the fortress to replace the soldiers who were originally stationed here. Everyone knew that their task was to defend here. In other words, they were to act as cannon fodder here to ease the enemy's first wave of attack. Through the previous conversation between the youth and the instructor, Dean guessed that the purpose of this foreign fortress was likely not to fight with the enemy, but to ease and contain them. It was to prevent the enemy's attack from being too fast and causing too much impact on the war god's wall. After all, once the war god's wall collapsed, it was estimated that no one could repair it. This was the masterpiece of God, and probably only God could repair it. Therefore, the Empire didn't allow the war god's wall to collapse and be damaged. Standing on the fortress, Dean looked in front of him. He saw a piece of muddy soil in the distance. Countless hoof prints were like sharp blades, causing terrifying damage to the earth. At this moment, the fortress under his feet was faintly trembling. The area in front of him was covered with white mist. It wasn't morning, but noon. However, the mist on the ground was exceptionally thick. It greatly hindered people's vision. In this white mist, it seemed that a dark color gradually emerged. The trembling of the ground was getting more and more intense. Everyone's complexion changed. Some people had already entered the demonic state in advance. They nervously looked at the depths of the white mist. Then, from the depths of the white mist, countless black shadows suddenly shot out. They were like black streamers that pierced their pupils. Chapter 9:36. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The overwhelming black shadows shot over. Dean squinted his eyes and saw that they were 3 feet long black spikes with barbs attached to the front. Once pierced, they could pull out a piece of flesh. Here they come, someone shouted. Powerful auras emerged. Many people instantly entered the state of demonic body. For a time, it was like a group of demons dancing. Dean saw that the other 2 Abyss Masters and several Dominators didn't activate their demonic body. Obviously, they didn't want others to know their ability unless they had to. In addition, there were 3 Pioneers who didn't activate their demonic body either. They were just on guard. In the blink of an eye, the black thorns had already shot over. Bang, 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 bang. The thorns were like raindrops caressing the fortress. They hit the boulders under the fortress and nailed to the top of the huge wood. More black thorns flew towards Dean and the others. Dean raised his hand and waved the demon hunting tool. After several clanging sounds, he blocked the oncoming black spikes. The strength of the spikes made his arms sink slightly. He was shocked. The spikes were equivalent to the full blow of the Pioneers. Although such strength was nothing for him, don't forget how far the distance was. It could still maintain such strength. Its body couldn't be underestimated. The black spikes continued to fly out of the white mist, and the strength gradually increased. Dean looked at the white mist while resisting. Suddenly, he saw that the shadow color inside was getting darker and darker. He could even see a vague, huge outline. Through the heat source reaction, he could see a large row of vigorous and restrained heat source figures, like a row of huge tanks, slowly moving forward. Ah! A scream came from his side. Dean glanced at it. It was a strange Pioneer with a demonic body like a lizard falling down. His chest was pierced by the black spikes. Although it didn't pierce the heart and killed him on the spot, he lost his combat effectiveness. While he blocked the black spikes, he looked at the others and found that the Pioneers who didn't activate their demonic body were already dead. Their bodies fell on the ground. From time to time, black spikes shot at their bodies, making them into hedgehogs. They wanted to hide their demon bodies, but they had underestimated the power of the black thorns. They were heavily injured when they blocked the first wave, and when they tried to activate their demon bodies again, the continuous black thorns made it impossible for them to find an opening. In the end, they were killed before they could even activate their demon bodies. Apart from the people in their tent, there were also many casualties among the temporary troops of the assault battalion in the other tents. Most of them had activated their demon bodies, making it look like the stronghold was filled with monsters and had already been conquered. Puff, puff. As the black spikes continued to attack, more and more people were unable to parry in time. Some were injured, while others had their heads blown off. Save me. Help me. I'll give you a battle record. The injured and the uninjured people around Dean felt the threat of death. They couldn't help but move closer to Dean, while the others moved closer to the Dominators near them. When these people gathered, Dean clearly felt that they were hindering him, so he reduced his action range. He frowned slightly. When he was feeling uncomfortable, he heard the angry shouts of other Dominators. He looked up and saw a Dominator kick away the Pioneers who were close to him when he blocked the black thorns. At the same time, the Dominator cursed loudly. Obviously, he was worried that the Pioneers would hinder him. Even if it increased his risk factor by 10%, it was still intolerable. Under the leadership of this dominator, the other dominators and Abyss also shouted at the pioneers who were close to them. Some dominators even activated their demon bodies on the spot, looking like they would launch an attack if the pioneers got close to them. Dean withdrew his gaze. The pioneers who were seeking shelter around him naturally noticed this. Seeing Dean's indifferent face, they were frightened and begged. Suddenly, they regretted that they didn't build a good relationship with Dean in advance in the tent. Otherwise, it would be so precious to be sheltered by the Abyss on the battlefield. It wasn't that they didn't have foresight, but most of them knew that the Abyss wouldn't shelter them in the face of danger, and might even push them out to block arrows. Based on this idea, they didn't deliberately try to win over Dean. Moreover, judging from Dean's indifferent aura, he wasn't a person that could be flattered with a few simple words. However, it was only at this moment that they realized that they had overlooked something. Sometimes what was fatal to them was a trivial matter to the Abyss. If they were close to each other, the Abyss would not refuse to help them, and this little bit of help would be enough to save their lives. Obviously, it was too late to say anything to please Dean. Many of them could only look at Dean imploringly and even wanted to kneel down to him. After Dean withdrew his gaze, he didn't look at the people who were taking refuge around him. He continued to wave the split sword to block the oncoming black thorns. He still maintained his original posture, blocking the black thorns that were shooting at him. As for the ones that were shooting at the people around him, he directly ignored them. Nevertheless, seeing that Dean didn't drive them away, these people were very surprised. Although Dean didn't help them to resist the black thorns, they could shrink their bodies and hide behind Dean when they couldn't resist the black thorns. It was a safe area, and they only needed to guard against the black thorns that passed over Dean's head. The arrow-like thorns lasted for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then gradually stopped. In the wide aisle of the fortress, there was a river of blood, and a large number of corpses had fallen. Most of these corpses were like hedgehogs, with sharp thorns all over their heads, eye sockets, throats, arms, and so on. Dean glanced at them and saw that more than 10 people had fallen in their tent. At this time, Dean saw dark silhouettes emerging from the depths of the white mist. Impressively, it was a row of nearly 6 meters tall monsters. They looked like porcupines, but their mouths had white, ivory horns. Moreover, there were not 2 horns, but 7 or 8 horns. They looked extremely ferocious, and the dark black hair on their body was slightly shiny, as if they were coated with a layer of oil. The black thorns that were previously shot were clearly the hair of these monsters. Behind these huge porcupines, there was a row of taller monsters. They were about 10 meters tall, and their physique was sturdy like a giant elephant, but there was no trunk. The protruding teeth in their mouths were straightforward like 2 white spears. There was a vertical horn on the top of their head, and there was no hair on their body. They looked rough and thick. The movement of these large monsters was relatively slow. When they moved forward, the ground trembled. The closer they got, the more violent the tremor was. Dean saw these monsters lined up neatly, and his eyes flashed slightly. They looked as neat as an army, and seemed to be trained by something. But since ancient times, only humans knew how to train animals. Were there really humans outside the giant wall? Dean knew that the earth was very big, and he guessed that the last survivors might not only be the people in the kingdom of God. There might be descendants of human survivors outside, but after all, he didn't see it with his own eyes, so he couldn't be sure. But at this moment, he was looking forward to it. Others saw the slowly advancing giant monsters, and they let out a burst of cold air. Even a few rulers' faces turned ugly. In the past, they usually hunted near the wall or the giant wall of the kingdom of God. Although they had seen the beast tide, it was only a small monster tide, and the momentum was far from comparable to the giant monsters in front of them. This vast momentum was like a tsunami, and just a slow and steady hoof step by step made people feel an irresistible sense of despair and fear. Whoosh! Suddenly a gust of wind rolled over. The white mist suddenly pushed forward and filled the air. Dean's eyes moved, and his eyes revealed a bit of dignified color. He squinted at the depths of the fortress, and suddenly saw countless red heat sources stirring. He was shocked. and immediately wanted to retreat. At this time, the sound of the engine of a fighter suddenly sounded, and it swept over the top of his head. Dean looked up and was shocked. It turned out to be a fighter bomber from the old era. Although the shape was similar, the fighter bomber was driven by steam, and the tail of the fighter dragged out a long white smoke and issued an extremely loud buzzing sound. When the fighter drove out of the fortress, it suddenly rose up, and from the bottom of the fighter, the plate opened, and from inside, a gas canister-sized bomb fell down and fell into the group of giant monsters. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of the explosion suddenly echoed, and the originally neat formation of the giant monsters suddenly issued a loud roar, like the long hiss of a giant elephant, and also like the roar of a lion. The explosion caused the giant monsters to suddenly become chaotic and swayed left and right. The giant monsters in the front row that looked like giant porcupines in the front row panicked, and some rushed forward in panic. Soon, they broke away from the white mist and rushed to the front of the fortress. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. From a shooting point in front of the fortress, a huge crossbow was pushed out, and 6 giant arrows that were more than 3 meters long, like steel spears, were shot at the same time and instantly hit a giant porcupine monster that was rushing over. The arrows pierced its back and head, and half of it went in. The giant porcupine monster was in pain, but ran faster and faster, and its eyes were red, as if it was completely out of control. From another place, another row of giant arrows were shot, and this time the 6 giant arrows were shot vertically. In an instant, the giant porcupine monster was nailed from the head to the tail, and it was shot dead on the spot, lying on the ground twitching. Everyone in the temporary army was stunned. They didn't expect the counterattack of the border guards to be so fierce. At this moment, they suddenly felt that in such a vast battlefield, the strength of a person was too small, and his sense of existence was too small. Whoosh! Behind the panicked giant beasts, in the depths of the white fog, a huge rock suddenly flew out and hit a steam-powered fighter that was in the air after dropping the bomb. It immediately fell apart, and the pilot also fell down from the broken pieces, screaming in pain. He fell into the giant beasts that were exploding nonstop, like a drop of rain falling into a muddy pit. There were no ripples at all. Soon, more and more giant stones were thrown out from behind the giant monsters, and more steam fighters were hit, forcing the fighter to stop bombing. A burst of powerful roar suddenly sounded from behind the giant monsters, and the panicked giant monsters gradually recovered their order, and then continued to move forward, stepping over the bodies of their companions. The white fog gradually spread to the fortress, and the vision of Dean and others was compressed again. The giant porcupine monsters in the front row came to about 500 meters in front of the fortress, and the hair on their bodies suddenly stood up, and then they shot out another blackthorn. Dean raised his hand to parry, and found that the strength was much stronger, and it was comparable to the attack of a desolate level master. Some of the pioneers who had resisted the sharp black thorns by themselves were pierced through by the enhanced black thorns and screamed miserably. The others were shocked and immediately shrank to Dean's side, and some of them clung to the wall of the fortress. Fire! At this time, Dean heard an angry shout, and then he suddenly felt a trace of coldness. Countless arrows flew from the top of his head, almost covering the sky, and fell into the giant monsters. Whoosh! Whoosh! 10,000 arrows were shot at the same time, 2 rounds in a row, like 2 fireworks. The giant monsters howled in pain. Although these giant monsters had rough skin and thick flesh, their bodies also had weak points, such as nostrils and eyes, which would be pierced by the arrows. After 2 rounds of 10,000 arrows, suddenly a dry heat came from behind Dean, and the surrounding temperature seemed to rise suddenly. Then he saw the sky was fiery red, and another 10,000 arrows were shot at the same time, but this time the arrowheads were burning with flames, which looked more spectacular. The arrows broke through the white fog, dispersing a lot of the fog, and fell into the group of giant monsters, and suddenly there was a burst of fire. The distance of 500 meters was not long, and although the giant monsters moved slowly, this distance had reached the point where they launched the attack. The ground suddenly trembled violently, and the earth turned over. This vibration was transmitted to the feet of the people, and from the feet to the body, and even to the heart and brain. It made people feel shocked and tremble. Dean squinted and saw that the giant porcupine monsters in the front row had already stopped shaking their hair and rushed to 100 meters away from the fortress. The real battle was about to begin. At this time, Dean suddenly heard someone call him. He turned around and saw that it was Zashi, who had talked to Dean before. "Dean, the fight is about to start. Let's get ready to escape." Zashi approached and whispered to Dean. Dean was slightly startled. Escape? Zashi was surrounded by a few dominators and some of the more capable masters of the inner wilderness and the pioneer level. All of them looked at Dean with a bit of expectation in their eyes. "We're just cannon fodder here. When these monsters rush over, we'll be the first to die. After we die, the regular soldiers behind us will attack. Then, it'll be their turn to fight. Instead of waiting for death here, we might as well escape," Zashi said quickly. Dean turned his head and looked at the huge phalanx of regular army. He frowned. "Where are you escaping to? We will die if we go back." "We won't go back," Zashi flatly said. "We will die if we go back, and we will die if we stay here. I think we will escape to another place, and the farther away from the war god's wall, the better. Maybe there are people living on the isolated land outside. Even if there is no one living here, we can survive by eating grass. I don't believe that the monsters here are so powerful. These monsters are obviously trained by something, and we only need to find an area where the monsters are weak to survive." Chapter 9:37. Dean's eyes flashed. He was a little excited. He always believed that the possibility of survivors outside the wall was very high. According to his previous conjecture, God's kingdom should be in the Russian region of the Old Era. Based on this deduction, on this Asian continent, there was still China, which was the most fertile land. Tens of thousands of miles away, there was also the American continent and the European continent. He felt that there should be survivors there. After all, the survivors in this area had developed into the kingdom of God. The other areas might not perish because of this. Human reproduction speed had always been very fast, and their survival ability was very strong. As long as there was a little fire, sooner or later it would burn thousands of miles. However, this isolated area was completely unknown to him. It would be a bit risky to leave the wall. Moreover, it would be difficult to sneak back once he became a deserter. He wouldn't be able to go to the kingdom of God to explore the secret of resurrecting the corpse king. "Don't hesitate. They are coming," Zash urged anxiously as he saw that Dean was tempted. Dean retracted his thoughts and looked at another abyss not far away. This was the second abyss in their tent besides Zaxi. His name was Jason. "Isn't he going to participate?" Dean asked. Zash shook his head. "He wants to stay. I try to persuade him." "Huh. He thinks that he can survive the war because he is an abyss." "Ridiculous." Dean whispered. "I'm sorry, but I want to stay too. My relatives are still in the wall. I can't go." "Relatives?" Zash looked at Dean. He sighed as he saw Dean's firm eyes. He knew that a person like Dean had a firm heart. Dean couldn't be persuaded with just a few words. Moreover, his relatives. He thought of his wife. His lovely child had just learned how to speak. His life was very happy when he was arrested and sent to the army. Unfortunately, everything had changed. He wanted to live, so he had to choose to abandon them. "I know." He raised his hand and patted Dean's shoulder. "Your choice may be right. At least you won't regret it." He turned to the people around him. "We will withdraw from the flank while the beasts are attacking the city. All of you throw away the personal support system. It can track our position." Others were disappointed to see that Dean didn't want to participate. For them, it would be easier to escape after they had escaped. Boom! The fortress suddenly shook violently. Dean and others looked down and saw that the huge porcupine monster was like a row of tsunamis hitting the fortress. The boulders at the bottom of the fortress were smashed and broken. The broken stones rolled down from above. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Huge rocks flew out from the depths of the white fog and crashed into the fortress. Immediately, a huge hole appeared in the protective wall built on top of the fortress. Some of the soldiers were smashed into meat paste on the spot. "Go!" Jashite shouted in a low voice. With him in the lead, he led more than a dozen people along the side of the stronghold. On this huge fortress, their movements were inconspicuous. At this moment, the other parts of the fortress were in a complete mess. Behind the fortress, there was a continuous stream of soldiers charging over to replace the fallen soldiers. Dean frowned as he looked at Shite leading more than a dozen people downstairs. But he didn't say anything. He stepped forward and stood in front of Aisha. He stretched out his hand and gently threw away the boulder that was rolling towards him. The falling boulder was pulled by Dean and thrown towards the bottom of the fortress. Although it was common to use softness to overcome hardness, it was rare to use it to the extreme. At this moment, Dean suddenly saw a large number of red dots emerging from the depths of the white mist. The next moment, a roar came out, and some short, about 2 meters tall monsters jumped out from the middle or under the legs of the giant porcupine monsters. They looked like featherless chickens, with rough greenish-black skin, sharp horns on the top of their heads, mouths full of sharp teeth, and 4 eyes. They were extremely terrifying. These monsters were flexible and had amazing jumping power. They jumped directly onto the huge spikes protruding out of the fortress. They used the spikes as footholds to jump towards the fortress. "Attack!" An officer roared in the distance. Dean grabbed the neck of a 4-eyed monster that jumped in front of him and threw it to the back of the herd. However, another one rushed up as soon as he repelled it. Dean punched with both hands. At this time, 2 or 3 monsters climbed up from the side of the fortress. They screamed and rushed towards Dean. Dean sighed in his heart. Previously, Jashite had left with more than a dozen people, which led to an empty space around him. There was no one to defend him. He held the splitter and waved it in a very fast and strange posture. 3 4-eyed monsters that jumped up were beheaded. Green blood spurted out and splashed on the corridor of the fortress. At this time, more and more 4-eyed monsters climbed up the stronghold, and the giant porcupine monsters at the bottom of the stronghold had retreated to the second line. Behind them, the giant elephant-like monsters sprinted and slammed into the stronghold. The entire stronghold shook slightly, as if it was about to collapse. The huge wooden support behind the fortress made a cracking sound. Some of the support broke, and the bark on the surface exploded. Dean stretched his head to look at the bottom of the fortress. His face slightly changed as he saw more and more 4-eyed monsters rushing out of the fortress. With the help of the giant porcupine monster and the giant elephant monster in front of them as a stepping stone, they bounced to the top of the fortress. There were countless of them. "Damn!" Dean cursed, turned around, and retreated with Aisha. When he left, he saw that most of the people in the same tent who didn't participate in the escape had fallen under the claws of the 4-eyed monsters. There were too many 4-eyed monsters, and almost all of them had the strength of pioneer level. Their attacks were ferocious, and the sharp sound they made was frightening. Many people didn't have the chance to show their real strength and were bitten off. Jason, who didn't participate in the escape, was surrounded by 4 or 5 4-eyed monsters. He still hadn't activated his demonic body. He seemed to notice that Dean was ready to retreat. He repelled 2 4-eyed monsters around him and winked at Dean. Dean understood his meaning and cooperated with him. He had no opinion and nodded slightly. Jason quickly swept away the 4-eyed monsters around him and ran toward Dean. "There are too many of them. We can't hold this place. Let's retreat while defending," Jason said quickly. Dean nodded. This was the first time he talked to Jason, and it was the first time he cooperated with him on the battlefield. He was about to retreat when he saw Jason quickly make a gesture. Dean's eyes moved and stared at him. "We can't hold this place. Let's retreat a little. We can't let these damn monsters get close to the war god wall." Jason's eyes were awe-inspiring. He was very determined, as if he was a hot-blooded warrior protecting the country. But the gesture he made at the same time had another meaning. Dean immediately understood why he did this. It should be because he had seen the magic of the auxiliary combat system. He was worried that this thing could monitor their words and actions, so he didn't dare to speak his real thoughts directly. Perhaps this was the reason why he didn't want to participate in Zaxi T's escape plan. Cautious, Dean had an impression of him and responded with a gesture. Jason took the lead and led the way. The meaning of his gesture was very simple. They should stay close to the fortress and try not to attract the attention of the regular army. Dean also had the same idea. He followed Jason and rushed down the fortress. He looked back and saw a large number of four-eyed monsters climbing up the aisle. Some of the four-eyed monsters directly jumped down from the fortress and rushed towards the soldiers behind the fortress. The huge battlefield was in chaos. Perhaps only by standing in the sky and overlooking everything could one understand the situation. But as a soldier, he was like a chess piece on a chessboard. He could only see things around him. But at this moment, all he could see was chaos. The breakout of the four-eyed monsters forced the regular army behind the fortress to participate in the battle. The fortress shook violently. It was estimated that it couldn't withstand the impact of the monsters. Once the stronghold fell, the entire battlefield would become a chaotic melee between humans and monsters. It would be the most dangerous time. Whether they could survive or not depended on luck. Guard the fortress. No one is allowed to leave their post. Just as Dean and Jason jumped down from the fortress, they heard a voice from the individual combat system on their wrists. Dean felt that the voice was familiar. After a careful identification, it turned out to be the previous instructor's voice. Damn! Jason's eyes were full of anger as he heard the voice. He wanted to say something, but soon held back. Dean was also angry. The four-eyed monsters were about to occupy the aisle of the fortress. Asking them to stick to their posts was equivalent to sending them to their deaths. Moreover, the value of their deaths was too low. Jason looked at Dean and gestured. What should we do now? Dean's face was gloomy. He was silent for a few seconds. Suddenly his heart moved. He lifted the individual combat system on his wrist and adjusted the scanner. Soon he found the coordinates of other friendly forces. A large part of the coordinates were on the fortress. They were the people who had died in the battle and the individual combat system that Zaxi and others had left behind. However, 2 or 3 kilometers behind the fortress, he saw 4 or 5 yellow dots surrounded by green circles. They were the friendly forces of the same battalion. Although the regular army was also a friendly force, but their yellow dots were not surrounded by green circles. Dean's eyes flashed. The previous instructor and several other officers had joined the same channel, so they were shown as yellow dots with green circles around each other. Obviously, the green and yellow dots a few thousand meters behind them were most likely the instructors and the officers. He narrowed his eyes and waved at Jason, signaling him to move closer. Jason slightly frowned and looked at him with some doubts. There was some vigilance in his eyes, but after hesitating for a while, he still approached Dean. He felt that he had no communication with Dean, so Dean would not attack him for no reason at this time. Although he was thinking so, he was still secretly on guard. Dean whispered a few words in Jason's ear. Jason's eyes lit up as he gave a thumbs up to Dean. Dean didn't say much and quickly climbed up the fortress. The part of the fortress that they were stationed at had been completely captured by the four-eyed monsters. There were only mutilated corpses left. Dean and Jason were the only ones who had survived in the same tent as Zaxi and others. When Dean climbed to the top of the fortress, he saw 2 four-eyed monsters gnawing on a bloody corpse on the ground. Dean had seen the person before. They had greeted each other and lived in the adjacent bed. But at the moment, the corpse was not breathing and the body was incomplete. Seeing Dean and Jason climb over, several four-eyed monsters suddenly raised their heads, slightly opened their bloody mouths, issued a burst of screams, and rushed towards the 2. Jason quickly shot and killed several four-eyed monsters. At this time, Dean took advantage of the gap and picked up the combat system that Zaxi and others had abandoned. He called out to Jason and brought Aisha back to the edge of the fortress. Jason followed closely behind and the two of them hid in a dark corner of the stairs. Dean took off the combat system and turned it off. Jason was surprised and amazed as he saw Dean's operation. He once again gave a thumbs up to Dean. Dean also turned off the combat system. The method to turn off the combat system was very simple. He pried open the back of the shell and took out the electronics inside. Others didn't know how this thing worked, but Dean was very clear about it. How could he monitor them if there was no electricity? He used this force method to turn off the combat system. Not only could he avoid the monitoring, but he didn't need to abandon the combat system. Dean and Jason took 2 combat systems and continued to retreat after they had turned off their combat systems. Stick to your post and don't retreat. If anyone dares to take a step back, they will be punished according to the military law. The instructor's angry roar came from the watch. Jason rolled his eyes. He lowered his voice and said, "This idiot doesn't want us to die. If there is no one inside the giant wall, then I will kill him. Don't worry, he doesn't know that we are retreating." Dean whispered. Jason nodded. Both of them shuttled back and forth on the battlefield. Many four-eyed monsters had rushed into the fortress and were fighting with the regular army. Boom! Dean felt something in his heart. He turned his head and saw a huge hole in the fortress. Stones splashed, and several giant beasts rushed in. One of the hundreds of regular soldiers roared, "Block the hole! Kill! Kill!" Chapter 9:38. Roar. The giant beasts roared furiously and charged wildly in the regular army. Many soldiers were trampled to death, and some were kicked by the raised hooves and swept away. The entire formation was broken, but the scattered soldiers were not as chaotic as the temporary army. Instead, they still surrounded the giant beasts closely and cooperated in small groups. They quickly climbed onto the back of the giant beasts. Then they ran to the top of the beasts' heads. Some of them attacked the eyes of the beasts, while others slipped into the ears of the beasts. Soon, a giant beast let out a blood-curdling screech. Its hooves, which were charging forward, lost their heads and fell on the spot. The surrounding soldiers immediately swarmed up and covered the beasts like ants. Soon the screams stopped. But at this moment, more and more monsters emerged from the hole behind them, including the giant porcupine monster that had retreated to the second line. As soon as it emerged, it howled and charged forward, shaking the hair on its back and shooting out countless black spikes at the reinforcements. In addition, a large number of four-eyed monsters drilled out of the holes. Next to the holes, there were beasts that used their horns to hit the cracks. The holes were getting bigger and bigger. Damn! Jason was frightened as he saw this scene. Although he didn't have a good impression of the regular army, but he also felt frightened when he saw such a wild and vast offensive of the monsters, especially when he saw a large number of the regular army being slaughtered. Perhaps he would die like this and turn into the mud under the hooves of the behemoth. He would accompany the soil outside the giant wall forever. Go! Duddian aimed at the route and shouted. Then he took Haisha and rushed in the direction where Zaxi and others had fled. Although he didn't intend to escape, but he could temporarily avoid the limelight and return after the battle was over. Anyway, his combat system had been shut down. It could be said that it was damaged during the battle. At that time, he could disguise himself as a lucky person on the battlefield and not a deserter. Jason followed closely behind. He saw 2 four-eyed monsters coming from the side. He immediately rushed forward and killed one. Duddian also killed the other one. His movements were clean and neat. Jason's eyes narrowed, but soon returned to normal. Most of the warriors in the charge camp had magic marks that were good at attacking. Moreover, both he and Dean were abyss level. Killing the four-eyed monster was like cutting melons and vegetables. However, Jason's attack was mainly based on strength. Dean's attack was extremely sharp and directly cut the monster. "Where are we going?" Jason frowned as he saw Duddian's escape route. Duddian whispered, "Avoid the frontal attack of the beasts. First we will go to the side of the battlefield to avoid the limelight. Don't forget that our combat system has been shut down. We won't be regarded as deserters." Jason understood, but he quickly thought of a problem and said in shock, "But if that's the case, Wouldn't the combat system we're carrying with us expose our route? And then they'll be exposed as well. Dudian whispered. We can't do anything about it. If we don't have the combat system, then we won't be able to see the situation of the battlefield. It's easy to fall into the encirclement of the beasts. Jason could not help but glance at him. Indeed, the perception area on the combat system allowed them to clearly see the situation of the battlefield, including the distribution and number of allies, as well as the number and distribution of monsters. It was beneficial for them to avoid risks and, at the same time, choose the best route of retreat. However, if the combat system was really monitoring them, it would be equivalent to betraying Zaxite and the others who had previously escaped. He remembered that Zaxi had talked to Dudian several times. Both of them seemed to have a good chat, but he didn't expect that Dudian would betray him without hesitation. If Zaxi knew about it, then he would go all out to find Dudian. There was a bit of fear and vigilance in his heart towards Dudian, although he would do the same, but Dudian took the initiative to do it. He had to pay attention to it. Who knew if Dudian would also cheat him? Hiss! Hiss! Dean and Jason fled along the fortress. More and more sections of the fortress were captured. From time to time, four-eyed monsters jumped down from the top of their heads and rushed towards the regular army. Some of them aimed at Dean and Jason, who were hiding, and rushed towards them. However, they were quickly beheaded by the two and didn't stay for long. Bang! A four-eyed monster's head was cut off and fell from the fortress. It almost hit Jason. Jason couldn't help but look up. He found that the fortress was completely lost. He became more anxious. At this time, a deafening roar came from the watches in their hands. You four bastards! Who allowed you to go there? If you take another step forward, you will be dealt with as a traitor. Jason's face slightly changed as he looked at Dudian. Dean ignored him and continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. He had previously taken 4 combat systems, so the instructor regarded him as 4 people. Bastard, do the 4 of you think that I don't know your names? Your combat system has a record of it. Whoever takes another step forward will be added to the list of defectors. I'll give you one more chance. Rilla, Nello, did I call your names wrongly? The instructor's angry roar came from the wristwatch again, and it was mixed with a strong, killing intent. Fuck! When Jason heard this, he couldn't help but curse. This bunch of bastards, they really tampered with it. Dudian slightly narrowed his eyes and opened an instant message button on the watch. He pressed his throat and spat out a word. Get out. Jason was stunned as he stared at Dudian. What are you doing? Scolding him. Jason almost vomited blood. Of course I know you were scolding him. Why are you scolding him? Although this bastard is a bastard, what if you irritate him? What if he chases after you? Dude Yin's expression froze for a moment. No? Jason was speechless. Forget it. We've already scolded him. Let's run. If he chases us, we'll be able to see it. If he dares to chase us, we'll just throw this thing away or turn it off. Dudian nodded slightly, but there was a trace of disapproval in his eyes. But he was running in front, so Jason didn't notice it. At this time, the instructor's voice came again from the watch in their hands. But this time there was no anger, but extraordinarily gloomy. Well, you continue. I want to see how you will escape. Jason stared at the watch and suddenly found that the previous instructor's green circle was moving towards them. He was speechless. This bastard is really narrow-minded. He really chased after us. He looked up at Dudian, who was running in front of him, and complained in his heart. Why do you care about this mad dog? If he likes to scold, then let him scold. Now he is stimulated and chased after us. He wanted to say a few more words, but suddenly froze. He saw that Dudian didn't answer. There was a trace of suspicion in his eyes. Did you deliberately lead him over? Dudian turned his head. Deliberately lead him over? What for? Jason saw Dude Yin's innocent face. It seemed that he didn't mean it. He couldn't help but frown. Was he overthinking? He was not sure, but he secretly calculated in his heart. He left a way out for himself. He suddenly felt that it wasn't absolutely safe to escape with Dudian. Who knew what Dudian was planning? If he really deliberately led the instructor over, did he want to borrow the instructor's hand to kill Zaxite and others? But what was the benefit of doing so? He couldn't figure it out, so he was only suspicious but not sure. The two continued to run forward. They found that there was a hole in the fortress in front of them. A lot of giant beasts and four-eyed monsters ran in. In addition, there was a reptile lizard that they hadn't seen before. Its whole body was covered with colorful lumps. At first glance, it was highly toxic. It spat out a small area of green poisonous gas on the battlefield. Many corpses of soldiers were lying in the poisonous gas. The corpses had been deformed, festered, and covered with poisonous sores. Dudian and Jason glanced at each other. Both of them rushed into the battlefield. Their armor made it hard to distinguish whether they were regular army or temporary army. But in this battlefield, as long as they were human, they could be regarded as allies. Moreover, Dudian and Jason had the combat system's positioning display. Even if other people saw them, they didn't care. Instead, some people came over to cooperate with them. Both of you will pin down the colorful lizard from the front. I will attack from the left, a young warrior said to Dudian and Jason. He didn't say anything as he jumped to the side and gestured to the two. Dudian and Jason looked at each other. They were speechless, but they pretended to raise their weapons and rushed towards the colorful lizard. The colorful lizard spat out a green poisonous gas, stretched out its extremely long forked red tongue, and rushed towards the two. Dudian and Jason rushed to the front of the green poisonous lizard. They were ready to attack. The poisonous lizard also opened its mouth to bite them. The warrior who had spoken before saw the opportunity and rushed over from the side. At this time, Dudian and Jason tacitly retreated at the same time. Dudian and Jason quickly escaped from the other side of the battlefield with Hylicia. The colorful lizard lost its target as the two retreated. It suddenly noticed the young warrior who was attacking from the side. It swung its big mouth to bite the young warrior's waist. Blood gushed out. The young warrior screamed and soon became the food of the poisonous lizard. Screams, beast roars, vibrations roars. Dudian and Jason ran all the way forward. After running for 7 or 8 minutes, they suddenly saw a lake in front of them. There wasn't a high fortress by the lake. After all, the fortress couldn't surround the entire war god's wall. The project was too huge. Even if the height and hardness of the fortress was far less than 1/10 of the war god's wall, it was still not a project that could be completed by the current kingdom of God. Therefore, the position of the fortress was often mountains, rivers, lakes, and other places, or some low-lying swamps and places suitable for making traps. Even if the monsters chose to take a detour, they would still be hindered. Even if they crossed the hindrance, there was still a large number of regular troops waiting for them. At this moment, Dudian saw that there were a lot of monsters in front of the lake. Some of them were giant ostrich-like flying monsters. Some of them were wet like giant frogs. There were even giant crocodiles that were crawling. However, there were spikes protruding from their back. There were also spikes on both sides of their tails. They were arranged like fish bones. They could cause extremely terrifying destructive power when they swept left and right. No way. Jason's face changed as he saw the chaos in front of them. Dudian whispered, "Can you fly?" Jason glanced at him and immediately understood what he meant. He smiled bitterly and said, "No, I'll take you." Dudian said, "Are we really going to retreat from here?" Jason hesitated. The war god's wall is very big. I've heard from the border envoy that this is the 7th region. Only here will be attacked by the monsters. The other areas should be very safe as long as we cross over here. Dudian said quickly. Jason hesitated for a moment but nodded. "All right, let's go." At this time, he suddenly glanced at the watch and was surprised. Did he stop? Dean looked at the wristwatch and saw that the previous instructor and the other 2 green and yellow dots had stopped in their tracks. Did he give up chasing us? Is there something bothering him? Dudian frowned. Jason saw that there was a trace of displeasure on Dudian's face. He felt that his guess was correct. Dudian deliberately lured them over. "Let's go. There are more and more monsters rushing over. This fortress won't last long." Jason reminded. Dudian nodded. He didn't activate the watch again. It would be too obvious. Not only Jason would see it, but the instructor would also see it. It would be counterproductive. The demon hunting tool in his hand melted in half. Part of his body was demonized. Sharp blade-like wings grew out his back. He held Aisha in his right hand and Jason's shoulder with his left hand. There was no lack of warriors who could fly on the battlefield. They flew in midair, shooting with bows, crossbows, and other weapons. There were also some who threw special weapons such as grenades that would explode as soon as they were thrown, shooting out countless tiny spikes that could easily injure allies. They could only be thrown into the depths of the demon horde, but the effects were quite obvious. These tiny spikes that exploded were astonishingly sharp, and when they pierced into the bodies of the demons, they would scream in pain as if they had been stabbed by a knife. It was like the screams of a strong man being stabbed by a needle. It was quite amusing to watch, but demons were different from humans. This could only mean that these tiny spikes were far more terrifying than they looked. Dudian flew at low altitude with Aisha and Jason. It immediately attracted the attention of many soldiers. Some people seemed to realize that the three of them were deserters, but they had no time to care. They had to keep their posts on the battlefield. If they failed to catch deserters, they would be punished. As for deserters, someone would take care of them. Dudian and Jason were relieved to see that no one paid attention to them. Dodging the venom and stone attacks from the monsters on the ground, Dudian quickly flew over the lake. He saw a long black back swimming in the clear water of the lake. It was the mutated, giant crocodile-like monsters. Chapter 9:39. Dean landed on the other side of the lake. There were several crocodiles wandering on the shore. It seemed that they were out of touch with the mainstream team. Seeing Dean and Jason land on the ground, several crocodiles immediately twisted their spiky tails and crawled over. Jason spat and took the initiative to greet them. Dean didn't go up to help, but looked around. He noticed some footprints on the ground, and the smell of Zaxite was still in the air. Apparently, they had escaped to this place. In less than half a minute, Jason had dealt with 4 crocodiles. He returned to Dean's side. Where should we go now? He didn't notice that he had unconsciously used to consult Dean's opinion. Dean looked at the watch. The green circles and yellow dots on it didn't move. It seemed that they had given up on chasing them. He was slightly disappointed, but didn't show it. He thought for a moment, hide the combat system, and find Zaxite. They should still be in the vicinity. They don't dare to go far. How do you know? Dean looked at the fort that was in chaos. They won't be willing to leave until they see this place collapse. Jason glanced at it and understood. We refused to escape earlier. Now that we've found them, what should we say? Can't we regret it? Jason was speechless. But if they are ready to evacuate, then do we have to evacuate with them? Listen to who is the leader. We have 2 Abyss members, and he is only one. Won't he have to listen to us when the time comes? Dean glanced at him. You and I will cooperate well. All right, I'll listen to you. After the 2 of them finished discussing, they immediately followed the tracks and smells on the ground. There was no fort on the other side of the lake, but there were no monsters either. There was a bare mountain in front of them. It wasn't suitable for the charge of the monsters unless they raised the mountain. But the movement would be huge enough to attract the attention of the Imperial border guards. Whoosh! Suddenly, a whistling sound pierced through the air. Dean looked to the side, and his face slightly changed. He saw a sharp arrow coming from the God of War's wall. There were several soldiers standing on the edge of the wall. They were holding bows and arrows, and it seemed that they recognized them as deserters. When the arrow flew before the 2 of them, its momentum had already dissipated and was easily dodged. However, the guards on the Battle God wall didn't shoot anymore. They merely watched coldly. This arrow seemed to be a warning to them. Jason cursed. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a loud noise coming from behind him. He was so frightened that he instinctively looked back. The tall fortress tilted slightly and seemed to be on the verge of collapsing inwards. Behind the fortress, the silhouettes of a large number of giant beasts appeared. It seemed that the fortress had many holes in it. Dean frowned. He didn't expect the fortress to be so fragile. However, under the attack of such a large number of monsters, it was no wonder that the fortress was not strong enough. After all, it was a man-made civil engineering. If it were a pioneer, he would be able to make a hole in it with a little bit of time. Meanwhile, the soldiers defending the fortress were all occupied by the four-eyed monsters, and no one could stop the huge monsters from ramming into the fortress. Naturally, the fortress would soon collapse. Dean retracted his gaze and continued to follow the footprints. 10 minutes later, Dean and Jason came to the edge of a mountain forest. Suddenly, several figures jumped out of the forest and stopped in front of them. It was Zashi and the others who had defected before. However, the number was obviously reduced by half. "Why are you here?" Zashi frowned as he saw Dean and Jason. There was a trace of imperceptible doubt in his eyes. Dean seemed to be relieved. "Finally, we caught up with you. You are smart. If we had run a little later, then we would have been buried there. As you can see, the fortress is about to collapse." Zashi looked at him for a moment, and his expression slightly relaxed. "Just the two of you? What about the others?" "They're all dead." Dean shook his head and sighed. Zashi wasn't surprised. It was a miracle that they were able to survive after such a long time in the front line of the battlefield. Dean and Jason were lucky enough to survive because of their abyss strength. If there were terrifying monsters in the beginning, then Dean and Jason wouldn't have been able to escape. They could only be considered lucky. He felt lucky for his own foresight. If you had come with us earlier, then we wouldn't have to take such a risk. We wouldn't have lost too many people. Dean and Jason looked at each other and sighed. They didn't want to talk about it anymore. Zaxite looked at the two of them and said, "You didn't bring a combat system, did you?" "Of course not." Dean shook his head. "That thing can locate our position." Jason and I had run halfway when we heard the coach shouting at us to return to our post. "Oh." Zashi was about to say something, but his face suddenly changed. His eyes were staring at the back of Dean and Jason. Dean was surprised. He instinctively wanted to turn his head to look, but his reason was one step ahead of him. Jason, who was beside him, had already turned around to look. His expression changed immediately. "Damn it, how did that bastard catch up with us?" Dean heard his words and knew that Zaxi wasn't blackmailing them, but he didn't look back. Instead, he frowned and looked at Zaxi. Zaxi's eyes were on him and Jason. Zaxi's eyes were filled with anger and killing intent. The others around him didn't hide their anger. "It's not us," Dean immediately said. "We are not stupid enough to cooperate with these people to catch you. I don't know how he found us." Jason quickly said, "Yes, we clearly saw him stop at our position when we lost the combat system. How could he catch up with us? Wait, did they use the location where we lost the watch to infer our escape route? Or do they have people with super strong perception?" Jason's face was full of doubt. Dean couldn't help but admire Jason. Although Jason's reaction was slow, but his acting was not inferior. Moreover, it was more real and natural. Even he might be deceived. He even suspected that Jason was deliberately acting slower to confuse his judgment. Zaxi stared at the two of them, the killing intent in his eyes not diminishing. "We're just temporary troops. In their eyes, we are cannon fodder, dead people. I hope you don't make a mistake and do something stupid." "Of course not." Dean sighed. The instructor and the other two officers had caught up with them. They stopped about 30 meters away from them. The instructor, who was standing in the middle, had a gloomy face. He saw that Dean, Jason, and Zashi were among the escapees. In other words, none of the members of the Abyss were fighting in the fortress. "Why aren't you running?" the instructor asked in a grim voice. Dean tilted his head and looked at him. He could see Zashi and others from the corner of his vision. "I'm afraid that you won't be able to catch up with us. You're going to die, but you are still stubborn." The instructor stared at Dean for a while and suddenly said, "I will give you a chance to catch this kid and then come back with me to confess. I will spare your life. You will only be punished to serve for half a year and be included in the regular barracks. If you're qualified, you will be eligible to be transferred to the regular army or retire and be sent to the Empire." The others were a little moved as soon as the instructor and the other two officers appeared. The dominators and pioneers around Zashi were desperate when they saw the instructor and the other two officers appear. The instructor's words undoubtedly injected a ray of hope into them. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.